6,000 cycles. 240,000 years. The sky was a mix of a deep crimson and pitch black, the darkness stretching on and on further than the eye could see. The floor was smooth and slippery due to a level of blood that reached to just about ankle height. The air was moist and humid, holding the stench of rotten corpses that seemed to pile for miles high. A figure stood tall in the darkness, though it was something they were barely holding together as their body rocked and swayed as if a stiff breeze would knock them over. They were of average height, with pale skin and dark brown hair that reached down to their shoulders from all angles, while it was filled with knots and sliced edges. They wore a thin black trench coat with a white shirt underneath, along with black pants and boots, all of which were battered and ripped, held up by hopes and dreams. The figure let out a raspy breathe, the space around him glitching slightly. His body shook with each second, yet he didn't stop after all. He had been doing this for 240,000 years, and like a light shining in the darkness, he saw a way to finally break free. Another figure stood a little ways away. Though this one was anything but human, it was made of writhing and bulging pink and red flesh that was mashed together to make a humanoid figure. It was taller than the other figure, yet it was wrong. So wrong. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, as if it didn't know how joints were meant to operate. It had no eyes, yet it stared into its opponent's soul, the bottoms of its head having rows of jagged teeth that jutted out, forming the shape of a mouth, yet that was done wrong as well. The sad attempted at a face on the living flesh twisted two ways, as if it couldn't choose to have a rage-filled scowl or a manic grin. It lowered itself like a beast ready to pounce, its voice echoing through the abyss like thousands of screams trying to be heard over each other. "You're getting slower," it taunted in a sing-song voice, one that came out like a mix between a broken record and nails down a chalkboard. The other figure smirked, his only arm raising to make a classic taunting gesture, while his voice sounded out through the abyss as if it was spoken 1,000 times in one instance. "Oh really, because from emceeing, I don't have to use my full speed to outpace you." The one-arm figure let out a raspy chuckle, his smirk widening, but only a centimeter or two. However, the living flesh noticed it instantly. Said flesh froze, the concept slowly processing through whatever this thing had in place of a brain. Its hards, or rather claws, curled into fist, the teeth that made up its mouth grinding together with enough force to make sparks. What, he demanded rather than asked, the bones that acted as its fingers lengthening as its rage and hatred grew to new heights. The figure with one arm chuckled. But much like his smirk, it was a fake facade, a trick one needed to get into that thing's head. And it was clearly working. That's it. That's it. His mind cheered. It's just oh so insulting being talked down to by a pest like me. The figure with one arm bounced on the balls of his feet, though he strained to keep his smirk going as jolts of agonizing pain shot up his body with each movement. He kept pushing, changing his classic taunt into a finger wave, one that was slow and filled with mockery. "Oh come on now, surely a god such as yourself wouldn't let itself be mocked by a fool." The living flesh lost whatever composure it had left as it screeched like a demon, rushing forward, its right arm forming a larger claw made of even greater serrated teeth. Its other arm flailing behind. The figure with one arm chuckled before he dashed back, moving in a blur of light green glitching energy. He dodged and weaved each of the living flesh strikes as they grew more wild and manic. But then he made his counterattack. The one-armed figure slipped under a slash from the living fleshing before he slammed a palm against its side, his hand glowing with the same green energy. The living flesh stumbled back a section of its side, turning to dust, though new flesh quickly moved in to heal the wound. The living screeched louder, swing his other arm downwards, the end of his hand balling into a spike fist of meat and sharpened bones. The one-armed figure counter with grace as opposed to brute force. He leapt upwards, landing in the elbow of the living flesh's attacking arm. Before the one-armed figure could attempt to counter, the living flesh tried to shoot spikes of bones out from its arm in a brutal attempt to end its opponent. It was something the one-armed figure saw coming. He leaned back, balancing himself on his only arm before his body was doused in glitching green light. In an instant, the one-armed figure glitched away, moving to the exact same position he stood in before his jump. He twisted his hips, putting all his weight toward a palm strike aimed at the center of the living flesh. That too was a feint, however. His palm stopped inches away from the mass of flesh where a set of spiked teeth had formed to try and bite down on the figure's hand. The figure twisted his wrist, holding the back of his hand towards the living flesh. Quickly he snapped his fingers. the surrounding air distorting as he did so. The living flesh was suddenly doused in that glitching green energy as its form was rewound to the position from before its initial charge. The figure pulled his only arm out to the side, green glitching energy gathering in his palm. Each passing moment made the energy more and more volatile, as if it were a nuclear reaction seconds away from a meltdown. The figure swung its arm forward, the collected energy shooting outwards in a crescent-shaped wave breaking the space around it. The living flesh met the attack head-on. The meat that made up its arms stretched outwards, the flesh further densifying to levels that defied physics. The wave of glitching energy sent by the figure slammed against the arms of the living flesh, the bones that made up its clawed hands digging into the center, redirecting the energy away from itself. The now two sources of energy flew through the abyss, eventually imploding on themselves from their lack of proper structure. Said release of energy sent shockwaves coursing throughout the abyss, launching titanic waves of blood into the air. After a beat of silence, the waves of blood lost their momentum, turning into rainfall that fell over both opponents. The living flesh kept its usual stance, standing like a rabid wolf. Meanwhile, the figure took the total opposite posture, keeping his stance upright and tensed, the clock hand in each of his eyes ticking by slowly as he honed his focus. The droplets fell into each of them, acting like fuel to the flesh, invigorating it to even greater levels of bloodlust. To the figure, on the other hand, the droplets of blood acted like acid, burning away any skin that made contact with. It never swayed his focus. Instead, everyone would simply rewind to beforehand, healing the damage effortlessly. The figure looked his eyes onto the face of the flesh, its expression twisting into one of both seething rage and confusion. "You are holding back?" It mumbled slowly, finding the concept difficult to believe. Internally, the figure smirked, trying to hold back his excitement as the flesh took the bait. Choosing to respond with actions rather than words, the figure changed his stance into something more akin to one of an Olympic sprinter. Once again, the air glitched, the glowing green energy pulsing around the figure with greater intensity than any of his previous attacks. The flesh paused, taking in the sight, before its grin widened to the point of splitting its face in half. "Stockpile," it stated, now sounding like a child getting a new toy. The figure held his breath, pulling all of focus to his next move. The flesh didn't stop him. Instead, it readied itself, holding out an arm as once again flesh and bones densified in preparation. That filled the figure with more confidence, although not for anything regarding his actual attack. It was for his true goal. His plan was admittedly quite simple, however, the figure had always been one to believe that there was beauty in simplicity. The energy continued to build as the flesh also prepared itself, its excitement growing with each second. Soon enough, the flesh would have its wish granted, as after a few more moments, the figure released the energy. He shot off in a beam of pure light, his speed breaking down the space around him for miles. The beam of light grew with each moment it traveled, continuing to build itself as the figure charged towards the flesh. The flesh laughed like a psychopathic demon, seeing the attack as a challenge, a chance to prove himself superior. And that was something it could never ignore. This was something the figure knew, and it was exactly why he knew his plan would work. Holding out its clawed hand, the flesh swung towards the figure as he approached. It was a clash of strength, a clash of resolve, a clash of willpower. Or at least, that's what the flesh thought would happen. Instead, the flesh hit nothing. It swung, cleaving the air apart with enough force to send shockwaves through the abyss for miles. It blinked, genuinely stunned, as his mind took a few seconds to process the sudden shift in tone. It twisted in place, its upper torso breaking apart to turn a full 180 degrees. That's when it finally saw what the figure was doing. The beam of light was still going, the figure still stationed at its center as he surged through the abyss in what seemed like a random direction. But the flesh knew better. It knew exactly what the figure was moving toward. With each second, the figure got closer and closer to his goal, each moment filling him with a burning desire to reach it. Sitting just above the floor of the abyss sat a deep navy blue light, a complete contrast to the red and black of the abyss. The light changed its configuration constantly, restructuring itself into shapes that were impossible to describe. The sight of the light gave the figure more strength, allowing him to somehow explode forward with even greater speed. Of course, his plan would just move along so smoothly as the roaring screech of the flesh echoed throughout the entire abyss. The blood that coated the floor bubbled as if it had been boiled from inside the center of a star. Faster than the human eye could track, tendrils of flesh shoot out of the blood, all coated in serrated teeth. The tendrils charged towards the figure, some trying to slash, some trying to stab, while others tried to block off his path. It didn't work. Thanks to the time the figure how to both charge up and build on his attack, he was able to plow through the tendrils, turning them to dust the instant he made contact with them. The flesh tried to catch up, chasing after the figure on all fours like a wild beast. But it was too late. Holding out his arm, the figure felt his fingertips reach into the light, all while the flesh screamed in rage. But the figure didn't care. All he could feel was the genuine smile that stretched across his face, his mind going completely calm. I made it. Cool droplets patted against the figure's unconscious form. It didn't stay that way for long, as the figure suddenly jolted away, his instincts making up bark out in alarm. He coughed, trying to blink away his blurry vision while he took in his surroundings. At first, panic took over his thoughts, his mind still stuck on the idea of being trapped in the abyss with the flesh. But then he felt the droplets that fell into his skin. They were cold, nothing like the warm, acidic blood that always tried to felt away at his skin. He froze, the nearly forgotten sensation acting as a way to tether him in place. He tired to breathe, shutting his eyes while he used to arm to feel at the ground around him. It was rough and coarse, yet also damp, with small cracks dotted the ground from every direction. The figure finished he breathing, trying to use his arm to push himself upwards. It took him a minute to do so, however, as his muscles quivered with each second of use while pain shot through his bones. But he didn't stop. He stood on shaking feet, his cloths completely soaked from both the rain and the puddle he was apparently laying in. He once again blinked away any blurriness in his eyes, managing to do so with more difficulty than he would have liked. That feeling was soon washed away, however, by the sudden realization of where actually the figure was. The pale city. The figure recognized it instantly, the saturated blue that covered the air, the way the buildings turned inwards towards the streets, and above all else he recognized its sheer size. And most importantly, it was the exact same street a certain bag-headed boy had made his final stand. That wasn't what locked the figure into place. It wasn't even close. Staring down the street that seemed to stretch on forever, the figure was met with the sight of a fog that blocked his view like a wall. There was only one thing visible through the mist, a small red light that blinked on with a hypnotic rhythm, that made the figure turn, his pain and weakness forgotten. He knew what that light belonged to, and the thought of it made his blood boil. He held out his hand, the air around him glitching with the same intensity as his hatred. Then he snapped his fingers. A glitching shockwave boomed out from the figure, pulsing throughout the entire city. The energy washed the fog away like if a power washer went against a small stain. The source of the blinking light had now been revealed in all its disgusting glory. The tower. The figure felt his hatred get suddenly replaced by a strange form of numbness. He had been waiting for this moment for 240,000 years. But now he was at a loss for words. The face of the tower shifted, its smooth black surface seeming to move on its own. A glowing yellow light beamed out from a metal eye that formed on the tower's front. It was a reaction to the pulse, the tower itself trying to find the source of the disturbance. And when it did, it froze into place. The beam covered the figure almost like spotlight as the figure stared at the tower with a blank mind. He didn't know what to do. He knew what he wanted to do, but he didn't know how. Strangely, the figure still moved his body, moving on pure instinct as the tower's eye widened in complete and utter shock. The figure's arm fell to his side while the air went eerily still. It's been a while. OLDFRIEND. The rain stood still, frozen in midair, the only sound being that of a distant clock. The tower's rapid wail of its alarm shattered into pieces. The golden light tried to flicker back on, yet it failed every time, as if its attempt had been cut off before it could begin. The figure's smirk slowly faded, his adrenaline quickly depleting, his bravado falling apart as he sighed while he lowered his arm, his face falling to a dead cold stare. He wasn't sure how to feel. In all honesty, he had been dreaming of this moment since the very start, yet now he felt dull, though he kept his guard raised, unsure of his old friend's next move. Inside the tower, everything was falling apart. The mounds of eyes and flesh shifted and stretched apart, its panic overloading. How was he here? How was he alive? The tower turned its attention back to its old friend, finding him simply staring up at him, waiting, giving him time. It could use that. But what could it do? Per phase. No, that was too much. But did it have a choice? If he managed to kill it, the cycle would end. The tower steeled its resolve, every last lump of flesh and eyeballs compacting as it moved to put its sudden plan into action. A tall zombie-like figure sat in a wobbling chair within a room that glowed with a soft purple light. The figure being the only thing in sight aside from his old flimsy chair that somehow held his titan-like frame. It was the Thin Man. Tendrils of flesh shot out from the darkness, wrapping the Thin Man in a cocoon. Yet he didn't resist. In truth, it had been years since he had been awake. After all, sleep was so much better than reality. At least in sleep you could just be. The cocoon of flesh clumped together, combining into a single blob on the back of the Thin Man's neck. He slinked up to his feet, his head dangling to his side, utterly limp, while he moved like a puppet controlled by a novice. He stood up, his upper body limp, neck and arms dangling in random directions, his legs being the only thing with some form of proper movement. As the door swung open, the Thin Man's form glitched before he vanished in a volatile burst of static. The one-armed figure tilted his head, slightly confused. He had expected his old friend to do something, but now. He sighed softly, stepping forward, a mix of vengeance and regret fueling his movements. He both wanted to and hated the idea of killing the tower, but he needed the cycle to end, to finally save everyone. Then static began to crackle throughout the air. A static hum filled the air, shaking the very world itself. The one-armed figure froze, his eyes widening, the clock hands within crawling to a stop. His face showed his only current emotion, fear? No. It was pure hate. Any and all slivers of sympathy washed away the light in his eyes, dimming his stare, turning blank. 3 simple words leaking from his gaping mouth, holding the silent threat. You wouldn't dare. Purple light stretched out from the opening tower, the cold stone scraping to the side as a shadow formed the light, clearing a path of rain from where he walked and hobbled. The one-armed figure's face softened the pain, and it was clear to see his eyes had closed for a few seconds as he held back the small trickle of tears that tried to break out. He took a deep breath, letting the air through his mouth and out through his nose, his head turning downcast as he did. The eye on the center of the tower closed, trying to block out the sight as much as it could, with only one thought running through its mind. I'm sorry. The Thin Man was not looking down at the one-armed figure just a few small steps away. The puppeteered Thin Man wasted no time reaching out a hand, the world bending and twist under the pressure of his static energy, only for the force to be evenly matched by the one-armed figure's, whose own energy reached out, shaking the air like it was caught in a vice grip. Forces clashed the middle ground, ripping anything and everything apart as the one-armed figure and the Thin Man pushed more energy to their clash. Until, boom! The Thin Man was launched backwards and into the air, his limp body flailing in the wind before he pulled himself up in mid-air, vanishing in a burst of static before appearing on top of a random building to his right. The one-armed figure followed, moving to the top of the next building in a flash of green glitches. A leg raised just above the one-armed figure courtesy of the Thin Man, the rest of his body hanging limp before he crashed his foot to where the one-armed figure once stood, only to find the remnants of glitches as the figure was nowhere to be found. The Thin Man soon found the figure once more as he leaped into the air with a bang before he slammed his fist towards the Thin Man's gut, a shockwave sending him crashing across multiple buildings. Bits of rubble floated in the air just above the one-armed figure, frozen in place. In the blink of an eye, the pieces of rubble shot out in a green blur, heading straight towards the recovering Thin Man, who had just enough time to form a barrier of static energy in front of himself. Rubble hit the shield like cannon fire, pushing the Thin Man back with each rapid hit until eventually the shield shattered to pieces once the final bit of rubble hit it dead center, the Thin Man stammering back, his arm already flailing for another blast of static. His desperate attack was countered by the one-armed figure who had appeared below the Thin Man, jumping up and ramming a fist into the Thin Man's chin, sending him flying into the air. But he wasn't done. The form of the Thin Man glitched in midair, being covered in the same green energy. The tower tried to move his spontaneous puppet, yet it was no use. Now the Tower of Panic, its plan falling apart. No, how can he still be fighting? He can barely stand. The one-armed figure cocked his arm back, his fist glowing slightly before the Thin Man came crashing down towards him in the blink of an eye. The one-armed figure crashing his fist into his gut again, sending him even higher into the air. Then it happened again. And again. The next 5 strikes were the same, with the midair thin man being pulled back down only to be hit even harder, flying harder into the air, the pattern repeating again and again, each hit more powerful than the last, shockwaves shaking the pale city as a whole. Time stood still as the one-armed finger reeled back his arm once more, the form on the thin barely holding itself together, now mostly a mass of static. The one-armed figure's face showed pain, horror, fear, but most of all, regret. His voice quivered, shook to the point of sounding like a child ready to burst into tears.
I'm sorry, Mono.
His fist plunged into the gut of the thin man, being the final nail in the coffin. The thin's man from bulged and shivered before he exploded in a burst of static, now fully destroying the area of the pale city that once clung to life, the buildings and streets crumbling under the pressure. The tower was hit the hardest. Stones slip apart and cracked into smaller and smaller pieces, the mush of flesh and eyes that formed the tower scream in both horror and desperation. No! Within seconds the tower collapsed in on itself, crumbling to chunks on rubble and clumps of dust as it crashed to the ground, kicking up a dust cloud that reached across the pale city's lower sections. The one-armed figure looked to the ruined tower and sighed, turning his head to the left, to the ocean. That should have been quick enough. The single clock hand in each of his eyes spun rapidly for a few seconds before he slightly smiled with relief. Ah, good. Just made it to the cabin. Plenty of time. The one-armed figure turned his head back to the leftovers of the tower before he blurred towards it in a flash of green glitches. Through a crack in some pieces of the tower, a small mash of flesh and eyeballs slinked out, rolling over itself to make it further out as far as it could. Once fully out in the pouring rain, the flesh and eyes began to shift and clump together, slowly changing shape and color. After only a few seconds, the mass of flesh and eyes had fully morphed into a human appearance. He looked to be an older teenager with long black hair and saddlebags under his eyes. His clothing was simple, a black baggy hoodie and pants with brown shoes that looked to be falling apart. He crawled out further into the mud and gravel that ripped at the tender flesh of his hands, his form quivering. He pushed out a hand ready to stand, until the one-armed figure appeared over him, showing a smile that was filled with rage and hate. Hey, a Mush. Mush looked up in panic, his eyes widening, his voice growing weaker. See, Chime. Chime chuckled, though his smile faltered slightly, his hate clear leaking through. Been a while. Hasn't it, old friend? Mush tried to speak, to defend himself, to plead that the cycle was the only way. But he stopped, letting himself fall to only be supported by his elbow. Just do it. Mush slumped his head, ready to accept his death, a mix of shame and disbelief as his past and worry for the future clashed in his mind. No. Mush's head shot up in shock as he looked into the neutral face of Chime, the glow in his eyes dimming slightly. Mush was now utterly confused. Why wasn't Chime going to kill him? After everything? Mush's voice filled with hope, though it was quickly shot dead by Chime, who pointed his only arm to Mush, his smile returning slightly. Don't get me wrong, I really want to kill you, like majorly. But you're more useful alive. Huh? Mush's confusion only grew. Chime sighed. Need you in order to get my arm back and finally kill it. Mush clenched his fist, his angry raising was Chime. Still unable to accept the truth, he turned his gaze to Chime, only shifting slightly under his old friend heavy gaze. You can be serious? How many times did I tell you it can't be killed? None of us can fight it. The cycle was the only way to keep it out. Chime shook his head. No. Mush blinked, then his eye twitched. What do you mean no? Chime shrugged. It opened a hole the second you started it. Mush's eyes widened, his fear was the first thing to rush over his face. But then came the confusion. Tita, then why did it come? Don't try to lie to me, I know how that thing would act, it wouldn't hesitate. Mush's yells died in his throat as he was picked up into the air by Chime, who was holding him by the neck. His grip tightened just enough to make Mush gag, but still let him speak. The clock hand within his eyes slowly to a stop, his voice cold while holding to many years of pain. It didnt underscore basa USEIW. SH old underscore OFF underscore T. IR underscore TIM. Mush's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates, the pain from Chime's grip forgotten instantly. Why you could fight it, but you're. Mush looked down to Chime's missing right arm while Chime himself chuckled. Disarmed. Chime sighed, the air leaking from his mouth glitching slightly. But yes, I could fight it. To a standstill, in fact. Guess I was right after all then, huh? Real Ison hit Mush like a truck as Chime let him fall back into the mud, tears leaking from his eyes. I didn't have to. Chime sighed once more as he leaned down to the sobbing Mush. Yeah, you did basically every wrong. Especially with that you just pulled. Mush whipped his tear, now standing up fully, being only a little taller than Chime himself, yet he felt like an ant in comparison. Mush took a deep breath and turned his eyes to Chime, his gaze resolute. I know you hate me. I hate me too. But I can help. Please, Chime. Let me help. Chime tilted his head to the left. I already said you're more useful alive and that I need you to get my arm back. Mush blinked before rubbing the back of his head while trying to wipe his eyes. Sorry. Chime huffed, stepping backwards up to a small pieces of rubble before snapping his fingers to get Mush's attention. Well, we're not done yet after all. Am not doing this alone. Mush stepped back in shock, his mind reeling from Chime's words, repeating them over and over again to try and make sure he heard it right. Why you don't actually mean? Chime laughed, raising his hand high while snapping his fingers once more. A pulse of green glitching energy coursed out, but it didn't merely stop at the edges of the pale city. No. It carried across the entirety of nowhere, all while Chime laughed. What can I say? We're getting the gang back together. The north wind floated above a barren wasteland, hiding its true form in the middle of an impassable sandstorm, a mental smirk on his face as he drifted about, not a care in the world. The ferryman leaned over the edge of his boat, looking out to the horizon of the ocean, sighing softly before he took a swig of his flask, taking long gulps of the golden liquid. The mirror man sat at a table, a cup of tea in hand, taking slow sips, his mind lost in his own delusions, all while an endless hall of mirrors showed what could have been of his life. Trapped under a collection of boulders on the ocean floor lay the pretender, contempt to simple be until the cycle started over again. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The pretender eyes shot open, her arms bolting upwards, effortlessly pushing the boulders off herself as he sat up in both astonishment and renewed hope. The endless hall of mirrors shattering into pieces, the glass shards shoot out in all directions as the cup of tea the mirror man was drink fell to the floor and broke into pieces. The flash the ferryman had been holding sunk into the ocean's depths as the ferryman himself froze in place. The nationwide sandstorm dissipated in a slip second, the humanoid form of the north wind being shown for all to see, being made up of purple and black wind. All four looked towards the direction of the sound, their minds all speaking in perfect sync. He's alive. Mush was just about ready to have a panic attack. Scratch that, Mush was ready to have a mental breakdown, all while Chime got ready to move onwards. He held out his hands, trying desperately to make Chime reconsider. Wait, he stammered out. Chime stared back unimpressed, but Mush carried on anyways. You can't. They'll kill me. Chime raised an eyebrow, his voice starting off mocking, though it devolved as he tried to fully stand. They won't. Dash. Chime coughed and wheezed, stumbling backward, quickly catching himself on a stack of rubble. Mush held out his hands, about to rush over to help, yet the glare from Chime stopped him in his tracks, yet his arms were still held forward, as if Chime was about to topple over like a fine stack of china, though given his wobbly form that very well could have been a possibility. Chime held out his hand, using his elbow to keep him upright as he slowly stood once more. He gently pushed his thumb into the left side of his chest while he rolled his shoulders slowly and carefully, the action making Mush even more nervous, while Chime let out thin and shaky breath. Clearing his throat once again, Chime turned his gaze back to Mush, though now the exhaustion could be seen in his eyes. I will make sure you live. Mush watched as Chime turned and tried to hobble away from the rubble, each step more difficult than the last, and after a grand total of 5 steps, Mush couldn't take the sight, so he held out a hand while taking a step forward. Wait! Mush's voice was almost a whisper, but Chime turned to the sound nonetheless. The cold stare that Chime sent Mush's way almost made him give in to let Chime carry on, but he pushed the feeling down as he held his right hand to his face, before his jaw unhinged and dangled downwards. Mush pushed his hand into his mouth, angling his palm so it pressed against his canine. Jabbing the tooth into his skin, he pulled it down and to the right, making a clean cut into the skin. Holding out his hand, a stream of lumping pink flesh oozed out like a trail of liquid tar, stopping once the first dollop touched the cold, damp ground before it shifted, pulsed, even until it moved back upwards, thought only slightly as it clumped together to form a simple shape. In the blink of an eye, the shape changed from pink flesh to a dark brown wooden cane with a simple curved handle. Nothing extra. No bumps, no dents, just a standard cane. Mush stepped forward, reaching Chime's side in a few bounds, holding out the cane with a shaky smile, while the cut on his palm began to pull itself together. Chime swiveled to Mush, snatching the cane out his hand without a word. Thought the glare he gave him told Mush everything he needed to know. What? Expecting gratitude or something unbelievable. Slipping the cane into his hand, Chime took a few seconds to test it, mostly by tapping it against the ground, seeing where it could be used safely, all while Mush clasped his hand behind his back, waiting for Chime to start walking again. Rolling his eyes at Mush's hesitation, Chime sighed and pulled himself onwards. Finally breaking away from the rubble, Chime and Mush found themselves on a random street of the Pale City. The rain pelted the pavement and buildings, all of which were twisted and turned at unnatural angles, though they had one thing in common: the fact they seemed to stare at the ruined form Mush's old body. The taps of Chime's new cane seemed to effortlessly overtake the constant drum of the never-ending rain. The only other sound that seemed to remain prevalent was the splash of Chime's and Mush's shoes against random puddles, which seemed to ground Mush to their movement. Chime was silent, his lips sealed shut, as if in a vice grip, his only hand gripping the handle of the cane tight enough to turn his knuckles white, while his steps fell into a deep, heavy rhythm that slammed on the stone, sending water up to his knees whenever he stomped in a puddle. The reason was clear to see. Mush followed in tow behind his old friend, keeping just enough distance to run if Chime suddenly decided to revoke his previous act of mercy, while his mind whirled with both confusion and panic. Chime's hatred of Mush was easy to see. The sheer loathing that Chime resonated would make most people collapse from terror. Mush was not most people. Mush felt the weight, the crushing pressure, the endless waves. He took it all. He did deserve it. After all, with everything he had done, Mush found it a miracle that Chime hadn't just turned him to dust, though judging from the stiffness in his shoulders, the slow deep breaths, and the fact he was gripping the cane tight enough to nearly snap the thing in half, Mush could fully tell that Chime wanted to rip him to pieces. Safe to say, Mush wanted to sink into the ground and just melt away. Then a thought hit him, or rather re-entered his mind, just one of so many things bringing Mush to a near breakdown. The thought of meeting with the other, after so many years, after everything he had done. Mush slid his hands through his hair, trying to push down the rising panic that threatened to make him spiral, when a slight tap knocked him out from his mental house fire. Chime's tired glare pulled Mush back to reality, a deep and long sigh of exasperation leaving Chime's throats. Chime hooked the cane under his armpit, using his hand to rub at his eyes with his thumb and pointer finger, his sigh turning to a rasp as he could just feel the panic that Mush exuded. "Calm down. I won't let them kill you." Chime's voice came out through gritted teeth, his hatred for the idea easy to see, and it might have well not been said at all given how little it convinced Mush. Holding out his hands to just pass his chest, Mush tried to plead his case once more. "Please, Chime, you can't. They've gone in." "I know." Chime's voice cut through the air like a gavel in a courtroom, so clear, so heavy, and so demanding for attention that it momentarily forced Mush's next thought to a spot. That moment of peace was ending when Chime began to move once again, unhooking the cane from his armpit before he hobbled onward further into the city, with Mush following behind. Turning a corner into a more compact street, Mush tried to ask the questions that were now piling in his mind, but the sight of Chime slightly tuning his head to the side let Mush know he would get some answers. At least answers Chime found acceptable. "I can fix it." His voice came out quick and raspy, so dry it sounded like he hadn't drunk anything in decades, as it was carried out alongside yet another shaky breath, this one trailing off like Chime's lungs were being squeezed for everything inside of which the sight and sound made Mush shiver. Shaking out the chill in his spine, Mush squinted his eyes at Chime's answer, now more confused at his old friend's cryptic replay, a notion that Chime seemed to pick up on despite him face away from his old friend. With a chuckle that sounded more like a wheeze, Chime turned his head to face forward again, though after the chuckle ended his voice grew more serious, with a hint of that same repeated effect for added measure. "It's me, remember. I can fix everything." The lack of footsteps was the only sign Chime needed to know that Mush had spotted walking. No, frozen was the more accurate. Mush was standing in place, his body teased and twitching slight, his eyes hazed as a replay forced itself through his mind. A replay of a memory. A painful memory. Chime turned back to Mush once. He had stopped, moving gently, leaning against a nearby wall for support, for stability, though he still winced at even the slightest contact. Mush blinked, shaking out the sudden recollection, but as soon as his eyes landed on the cold, stoic glare of Chime, he looked away again, unable to keep what little composure he had left. grunting in both annoyance and exacerbation. Chime, slowly pushing himself from the wall, planting the cane in between two cracks on the ground to steady himself before walking off. Without a word. Slipping from alleyway after alleyway, the two remained silent, not a signal word, just a cold, long emptiness that said everything needed. The change in the silence came not from Chime nor Mush, but instead by the sound of glitching manic cries that echoed through the abandoned streets. Turning yet another corner, Chime and Mush found the reason for the choir of ear-piercing wails. The viewers. A swarm of the mindless monsters hobbled together near the broken window of a random building, a shop, a restaurant, a spa. It didn't matter. What did matter was how they were all screeching and scrambling over each other while their bodies twitched and convulsed. A few had grabbed another face in a death grip before trying to peering past the twisted and folded skin. The two fully stepped out to the center of the streets, eyes glued to the horde of viewers as they all crumbled to the floor as if they were going through withdrawal. Mush scoffed at the sight, feeling his skin crawl. Though for the half that felt revolted at the idea of the viewers, the other half felt disgusted at himself. _H. Just as the two had turned they back to keep walking, one of the viewers seemed to notice them, its yell getting the attention of its fellow devils as they turned their dead eyes towards Chime and Mush. They remained unfazed. Chime turned away with a sigh before he kept walking without a word, uncaring to the now rushing horde of viewer. Mush watched him keep walking for a few seconds before he turned his head to the horde. He sighed, holding out his hand, feeling his skin bubble and stretch. Before it burst. A wave of saggy pink flesh exploded outwards, taking only a second to fully cover the wide street, the wave rising for a moving wall. The viewers paused, shock overloading them before the severity of the danger fully reached their mind, instincts screaming to run. It didn't help. Mush felt the first of the viewers get engulfed by the wave. Then another. And another. It didn't take long, only about 20 seconds, but to Mush he felt in slow motion how each viewer tried to struggle yet were kept still by the white of the flesh, how their skin sagged, falling off and skinning into the flesh itself, how the bones cracked, then turned into a thick viscous liquid, also melting into the flesh before finally the entire thing was fully devoured. As fast as the wave shot out, it slivered back into Mush's hand, soon reforming, taking a few seconds to turn from pink to its usual pale. Realizing he was wasting time, Mush turned and quickly chased after Chime. This pattern carried on for the next hours. Chime and Mush would casually move through the pale city streets and alleyways, with Mush consuming any viewers that dared to get close, until the two reached a small port near the back of the city where rows of old boats laid rotted from lack of use. Mush moved off ahead without a word, already understanding why they were here, and so he went searching boat after boat, dock after dock. Another 30 minutes passed, and finally Mush had a stroke of luck. In a bank of sand just next to the dock was a rowboat, one their size. Even the only notable degradation was how the paint appeared to be peeling off. Mush sighed in relief and turned to go get Chime, only for his old friend to already be next to him before he walked past him and headed to the boat. Exhaling in relief, Chime sat down on the back end of the boat, placing the cane down by his feet. He turned at the sound of sand shuffling. Chime watched as Mush moved to the back of the rowboat, cracking his neck before he began to push the boat out of the sand and onto the water. Quickly chasing after the boat, Mush leaped into the air, catching the boat's edge before pulling himself up and inside, taking a seat near the front. Behind, he grabbed both oars, reshuffling his drip before he began to paddle. As the fog slowly covered more of the pale city as it grew further and further out of view, Mush found himself lost in thought. He had honestly been avoiding thinking about everything as a whole, but now, with the repetitive motion of rowing the boat, and with the only major noise being the gentle waves, Mush could only think. And once again his nerves came back at full force. His mind cycled through everything that had happened and was to happen. Chime's return, how he broke the cycle, Chime letting him live, seeing the others again. Then it hit him, a thought that hadn't quite reached Mush's mind, but had most certainly done so now: Mono and Six. His head whipped upwards, starting directly at Chime, who seemed to also be lost in thought, but once Mush's eyes reached his he soon snapped out of it. Chime tilted his head slightly, waiting for Mush's question, while Mush himself swallowed the lump forming his throat while he tried to think of the best way to word it. What's that plan for those two? Chime blinked, his eyes narrowing. They're not going near us, if that's what you're asking. Chime's voice was a cold whisper, the underlying message easy to read. Mush shook his head, slowly pushing down the memory that were brought to the surface. And no, I meant like, in general. Chime's eyes stayed narrowed, but he did seem to believe Mush, if only slightly. Coughing to clear his throat, Chime sat up straight, opening and closing his mouth slightly before he started clicking his tongue off the roof of his mouth again and again, but with small variations. Some were quick like snapping fingers, while other were long like an echoing clap. Mush blinked before the memory played in his mind. This was more welcome and manageable, especially compared to the last few. Even though Mush had figured out what Chime was doing, that still didn't answer his original question. Mush leaned back while keeping his questing to only his mind. Why tell him whatever? Water crashed and evened out as Titanic paddled slammed against it, pushed the larger boat with the ferocity of a wild beast backed into a corner, the oars beginning to crack and splitter from the sheer force. The ferryman was overjoyed, thrilled, ecstatic, but most of all, he was filled with reignited hope. He kept paddling, each minute adding more intensity. His hat threatened to fall off into the water. His hands almost snapped the oars in two from his grip, and his jacket gained a darker shade from the constant amount of water that splashed against it, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting to land, which would probably take a while given how far to sea he was. Click. The ferryman's rowing ended in an instant, his ears perking up at soft sound that came from all directions. He stood up, his first instinct to check the water below for any kind of monster, but the sound came again and again, more from around the air than the water, and so the ferryman listened in trying to figure out what it was. Then it hit him. In a flash he ruffled into one of the countless pockets that made up the inside of his coat, quickly pulling an old journal that hadn't been used in years, but one the ferryman refused to throw away. It held to many memories. Shaking away the ferryman sat back down, opening the weather journal in one of its few remaining pages. He held up his left hand before his pointer finger began to crease and wrinkle. Before in half a second his pointer finger shape-shifted into a simple pencil that he used to frantically jot down the sound. Or rather, the message. Once each click was noted down, he looked towards his completed message, which was made of Morse code, the short clicks being used as dots while the longer ones were dashed. Rubbing his eyes, the ferryman read the code out loud. Straight face, // // The ferryman blinked in confusion, reading the translation to make sure he wasn't seeing it wrong. Bring them to the maw? The ferryman held the paper closer, trying to check if he had misread or mistranslated the code, but as the clicks kept sounding in the air again and again, he was now sure he had done it correctly. Sitting back on the boat, the ferryman thought over the idea. Well, if she could make it through, no problem. Bringing the both of them should just be extra. But why do it in the first place? That's when it hit him. The lady. Whipping his head back up in realization, if he brought them both to the Maw 6 could get her powers and she wouldn't have the mental blockage like Mono. Slowly the ferryman began the chuckle, an insanely deep sound that seemed to make the water around his boat ripple. This is real, the ferryman eventually said after he managed to calm himself down, though not before he slowly leaned forward while resting a hand over his face, letting out a tried but triumphant sigh. He's really back. Mush was exhausted. His limbs felt heavy. His throat felt dry. His shoulders were shaking, and above all else his head felt lighter than air, sending his vision into a whirl rather than anything even close to stable. The reason for why Mush felt as if he was about to either sliver away or melt in between the planks of wood that made up the rowboat. Well, maybe it had something to do with the fact he had been rowing the thing for the past 3 days. Although if someone were to ask Mush if he wanted to take a break, he would have yelled to do anything else. Well, he wouldn't yell, he would really just shake his head and mumble incoherently, but the idea of taking any form of rest refused to sit in his mind. Then again, as Mush looked out to his sides and saw only endless ocean on the horizon, the weight that filled his arms seemed to increase. And so he sighed in defeat, letting the paddles rest in their holsters as the boat came to a full stop in the middle of wherever they were, the waves coming to rest after a few moments, coinciding with the same time the boat itself stopped the majority of its swaying. Taking a deep breath through his nose, Mush took in the sights, sounds, and smells around him. The water was a rich navy blue, but Mush found it looked almost purple if he squinted hard enough. The water looking flat, and even the setting sun gently bouncing light off the rarely seen waves. The air let off a gentle breeze, almost whistling in Mush's ears, calming him if only slightly. The smell of salty sea water filled his nostrils, sending a prick down the back of his throat, the mix of pain and discomfort keeping Mush from falling asleep. For a second Mush wondered why he was so against the idea of letting himself relax. Then the reminder kicked open the door to his mind like a sweat raid. Flinging his eyes back open, Mush looked to his cause of constant stress. Right, he thought to himself as he looked to the other side of the boat where Chime was currently slumped over in a heap. To an ordinary eye it would appear Chime was either sleeping with his eyes open, or he was dead. But Mush knew better. He could tell for an absolute fact that Chime was awake. The reason he was able to tell was the sudden bone-chilling freeze that fell throughout his body whenever he met Chime's eyes, the kind of fear Mush knew Chime was sending on purpose. Forcing himself to keep his eyes opened rather than squeezed shut, Mush sat up straighter, although he still found his arms too heavy to lift. So the silence was pulled onward, growing increasingly awkward for Mush as he no longer had the task of rowing to keep him occupied. Now, without any form of distractions, Mush got lost in his thoughts. A terrible mistake. In truth, Mush had tried to hold his mind back from processing everything. The fear of fully considering it all was like his mind was being turned inside out. Alas, his mind began to whirl, bouncing around from one point to another, accumulating everything that had happened in the past 3 days. Chime's return. The cycle's end. Planning on meeting the others again after all these years. The thought made his queasy. What is it? The sudden voice made Mush flinch, the living flesh in human form, looking over to Chime, who shifted slightly. Chime's voice was low and raspy, the end of his question coming out in more of a wheeze as he lazily turned to Mush. What? Was Mush's reply as his eyes slid from point to point, unsure of where to look. Chime sighed, slowly lifting his arm up before planting it against the edge of the boat, each movement making more of his joints pop and crack. Carefully, Chime pushed himself to a full sitting position, cracking his neck and jaw as he did so, each pop seeming to send jolts of relief through his body, even if they seemed to be brief. As Chime turned his head forward, his eyes met Mush's, the single clock hand in each ticking by slowly, as if they were rusted and someone was jumping on them just to get them to move. The glow of his eyes still remained, yet for a few moments it seemed to dim like a candle flickering, yet it was for only a second. Mush felt the weight of the gaze, even if Chime's eyes were hidden behind a curtain of matted hair that went past his face. Chime moved his sleeve under his hair, moving his arm upwards to wipe the corner of his mouth where a light green liquid had began to pool. He threw his arm out to the side, sending the liquid into the water, causing it to bubble, then reset. Mush watched on with bated breath, too nervous to try and repeat himself, and thankfully, he didn't have to, as Chime slumped forward again before his voice came out in another rasp. What are you thinking about? Was Chime's eventual question. Mush paused, taking a minute to think, or rather he was choosing what questions to ask. A couple of questions came from the top of his head. What was the actual plan? Where are we going? Was he really going to stop the others from ripping him to pieces? But those felt too heavy, too sensitive, too much to consider. Then the perfect question settled into Mush's mind, something he had been wondering since he and Chime had left the Pale City, but felt too nervous to ask. But now, with Chime asking, he felt the time was right, and so he looked away while stretching his neck, forcing the words out. Why have those two taken to the maw? Mush let out a stream of air once the question was lifted off his chest, as he began to fidget with his palms, waiting for Chime's answer, which first came in the form of a long sigh. So that she can get her powers. Chime eventually returned Mush's question, with his tone making it clear. He thought the answer was obvious. Mush shook his head, already accepting that part, but other factors to that idea rocked him with inner turmoil. But what if she? Before Mush could continue, Chime tilted his head, and for just a second Mush thought he saw the hints of a smirk tug at the corner of Chime's mouth. However, any chance of getting a better look was blocked by Chime's drape of hair. She won't. Chime voice echoed across the air, and waves. The two words sounded as if spoken hundreds of times in the one instance. Chime's hair parted by just a few centimeters, letting Mush see the light green glow of his eyes, while the single clock hand ticked by with increased vigor. After all, Chime pulled his head up slightly, the veil of hair moving back to block his eyes. You can't pluck out her shade this time. And there it was. That single sentence nearly sent Mush spiraling. Regret and remorse flooded his body and mind, but it wasn't only at the memory of what he had done for every cycle, it was the fact he had been so used to it that he had forgotten what she was like before. Whatever look that had crossed Mush's face seemed to make Chime satisfied as he leaned further back with a fulfilled hum. Then the awkward silence came back, which felt suffocating to Mush yet cozy to Chime. It did have to end, of course. They couldn't keep moving if they just sat on a boat in the middle of the ocean now, could they? sighing in acceptance of needing to at that very least keep the current conversation going, and so Chime turned his head to the side slightly from where he had previously been staring out into the endless horizon of the ocean. "We're heading to the wasteland." His voice drolled out, accompanied by the rasp that seemed to be his new normal. Mush blinked his mind, trying to clarify Chime's words as confusion washed into his mind. Said confusion filled Mush's next action as he turned his head back to Chime while narrowing his eyes.
Really?
"That's still 3 or 4 days away. Wouldn't it be better for us all to meet up somewhere closer?" Mush's voice was unsure and shaky, but still both confused and curious. When Chime turned his head to Mush once more, his shroud of hair kept his face fully hidden, although the blank stare he sent Mush's way could be felt through the air as his voice, while still raspy, came out in a deadpan tone. "You think North won't get lost going anywhere else?" Mush hesitated before he could speak again. Rather, he rubbed at the back of his neck, mentally yelling at himself for forgetting something like that, although new questions popped into his mind, practically forcing their way out his throat before he could stop himself. "But what about the Oth?" Before Mush could finish his questions, Chime interrupted him, his voice calm and low. "They know. They're on their way now, actually." His voice trailed off as if Chime was in the middle of checking the fact for himself. If Mush was confused before, he was baffled now, but not only at Chime's reassurance but the potential facts that would bleed out from it. Chime held up his arm, even with the apparent effort it took to do so, as Mush found his next words die in his throat as Chime's voice came out in an even greater raspy drawl. "Yes," he said while sighing. "I've been checking from time to time." Mush tried to speak again, but Chime lightly snapped his fingers to cut him off once more. "And yes," he huffed out again. "I was able to see what was happening when I was fighting it, but it was only in small bits. Snippets, really." Mush felt his brain stall for a second or two, the idea being difficult to comprehend. However, at the very least it saved him having to explain anything. Nevertheless, the idea of Chime knowing anything still sent a shudder of anxiety through his bones. Another silence passed over the two, Mush now holding both the weight and relief of Chime's reveal. Suddenly Chime blinked as he craned his neck to the right, seeming to stare off at nothing, until he gently sighed while a small and gentle smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Mush glanced over to Chime, trying to piece together what gave him that reaction. Before Mush had time to look away, Chime glanced back to him, scanning him up and down before a sharp breath leaked from his nose. "Those two have reached that port town," he said simply, his tone filled with both boredom and annoyance at having whatever he saw be ruined by Mush's curiosity. Mush slowly looked to the direction Chime had, mentally visualizing the idea of both of them being there rather than just 6. Before a thought poked at the back of his mind, a voice that echoed through his skull. "Do you think he can actually get them there?" His voice came out in a gradual crawl, sounding as if he had only picked the next word after he spoke the last one, creating something that felt like reading to a toddler rather than an actual sentence. Chime seemed to chuckle at the thought, though he made no noise. Instead, he dipped his head before shaking it slightly in the manner of reacting to someone saying something utterly stupid. "Of course," he said, his voice still holding the slightest bit of amusement. Mush waited for a few more seconds to see if Chime had anything else to say, but when nothing else left his mouth, he found himself in need of another distraction. That's when he realized that, with the time taken for his conversation with Chime, his arms had gone back to normal. It was in that moment that Mush had never been more thankful that he could recover energy quicker than most people. Chime felt his form begin to sway as Mush grabbed the boat's oars once more before he began to paddle away, taking a moment to re-find his rhythm. Chime felt a strange mix of boiling hate and numbness at the general presence of Mush. With everything he had done, that was expected, but perhaps with the hope of getting to see the others again, it was evening out. Either way, it felt weird, but he tried not to think on it too much, instead thinking about how exactly Mono and Six would be getting on the Maw, or rather who was taking them there. Panic, dread, anxiety. All could be used to describe the feelings of the ferryman, at least at a surface level, but on the inside he had never felt so completely anxious. He stood in a random alley squished between the buildings of a random town where columns of residents march, thought through, all acting like mindless drones as they sauntered their way around, dressed as if part of an upper-class society. Tapping his feet against the somehow sticky and wet pavement, the ferryman felt his mind race. He shoved his hands into random pockets that lined his coat, pulling them out again before he crammed them back in, just trying to do something to keep his mind occupied. It didn't work, rather it only seemed to make things worse, as the ferryman was now focusing on everything around him, listening for any kind of sight or sound that didn't belong. That thought felt weird to think of. After all, how many times had he done this? How many times had he waited in this exact alley for her to arrive just so he could whisk her away towards that dreaded resort just to get a few years of peace before she took over? In truth, he didn't know. Sure, he had been keeping count of the number of cycles, but he had never actually noticed when he began this routine. That thought sent a jolt through him, a reminder to how things were different now, how Chime had returned. The ferryman coughed, not to clear his throat, but instead to center himself as he let his hands rest at his side, while he put an end to his feet tapping now. He locked his gaze out the alleyway, scanning the street with laser focus, determined to not ruin this chance. And so the ferryman moved, creeping towards the entrance of the alleyway in order to get a better view. Peering his head out marginally, the ferryman watched for any and all sight of the two children that were now unknowingly freed from the cycle. Once more the ferryman watched as the rows of residents marched through the streets, their bodies fat and plump with sagging skin that looked to almost be melting. The ferryman felt disgusted at the sight. He always had. That was something time could never change, but over the years and cycles he had learned to just push the feeling down. Seconds ticked by and the ferryman felt his patience wear thin. How long did this part take anyways? Frankly, he had no idea at this point. He would turn his brain off and wait for the briefcase to spill. Now, with renewed vigor, the ferryman's eyes glazed over the streets, his neck twisting to watch a section of main road to his right. Stomping along on the sidewalk just like the rest of its fellow workers was a standard-looking resident, its gut bursting outwards, pulling the fabric of its clothes to their limit. Its eyes looking just about ready to bulge out from their sockets, while its gaze locked on dead ahead, completely unaware of its surroundings, just like every other monster that was nearby. This observation, however, never crossed the ferryman's mind. No. The first thing that he noticed was how the case of said resident had spilled open, its contents rolling out into the street, utterly ignored by its owner. That was the first cue for the ferryman. The second was the two sets of tiny footsteps that rushed down the middle of the street as they tried not to be crushed by the boots and shoes of the residents. The ferryman moved like a shadow, his bulky frame slipping through the crowd effortlessly, and subconsciously his mind solely focused on the two tiny sets of feet visible through the cracks. The ferryman wasn't really sure when he stepped into the path of the two. All he did know was that it happened. Dropping his head down, the ferryman felt the sight rush into his brain. She was standing right there, dressed in her signature yellow raincoat, and with matted black hair that covered her face, stood Six, looking frightened and ready to bolt. That wasn't what caught the ferryman's eyes. He was there. He was standing right in front of the ferryman, holding Six behind him, ready to fight, to protect. Right in front of Six, ready to fight back rather than run, stood Mono. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, at least for the ferryman, as he fully took in the sight that met him. He was really here, truly. He was standing right there, so close that the ferryman could reach out and touch. But then he saw something. It was only for half a second, but sent a sudden idea jolting into his head. It happened as Mono stepped back, his body lowering, and through the eye holes of his paper back flash a dull navy blue light. That flash of light made the ferryman retract his extending hand. Could he use it? Could he control it? If one thing was for sure, the ferryman was not about to risk it. So he kept his hand to his side, his eyes taking in their unsure movements, though they seemed calmed by his lack of any attack, even if it was only by slightly. Suddenly the ferryman shot his head upwards at the sight of movement, or rather the lack of any movement. Craning his head from left to right, the ferryman took in the surrounding residents as they moved to encase the three. Quietly the ferryman cursed under his breath as he tensed his shoulders. How could he be so stupid? Of course these things would be closing in. In all honesty, it had completely slipped his mind by this point. He would just jab out his finger at the girl and carry her off, but it clearly wouldn't work this time if the flashing static light from Mono's eyes was any sign. Thinking quickly, the ferryman squared his shoulder, clenching his fist as tightly as he could manage before he turned his head from right to left, sending a hate-filled glare to every resident that dared to get close. Safe to say, none of the monsters even considered the idea. The sheer presence that the ferryman gave off felt like trying to stand against the wave of a tsunami. Sighing once the residents had backed off, the ferryman turned his attention back to Mono and Six, who still seemed weary yet somewhat more relaxed at how the ferryman had kept the other monsters at bay. Taking a few seconds to think, the ferryman slowly laid out his hand, trying to be as gentle as possible, though he doubted it had much effect. Carefully the ferryman spoke, his voice still holding that gruff low boom, yet was held back to a hush whisper. "It's not safe, we have to go." He moved his hand downwards, slightly heading towards the still cautious Mono and Six, who of course seemed hesitant to the idea, yet they could neither see nor think of any other options. And so the duo stepped onto the ferryman's hand, Mono leading the way while Six looked to be clearly not trusting of the idea, yet Mono seemed to whisper something into her ear which managed to get her on board. Thus the ferryman began to raise his hand, making sure to keep the two children steady, while he used his free hand to try and keep them out of sight from the residents who were all now staring like an endless sea of cameras just waiting for the chance to charge. Now walking through the cold but unfortunately alive streets, the ferryman felt his breath slowly solidify in his throat, his eyes constantly moving from one resident to another. The residents themselves weren't the actual problem. The ferryman knew fine well that he could deal with all of them without too much effort. No, the problem was the two children currently standing within his cupped palm. The ferryman was sure he could kill every resident, no doubt about it. However, he was unsure wherever or not he could keep the two children safe while doing so. Therefore, he blocked out any plans of confrontation from his mind as he trucked on through the streets, making sure to keep his head low as he ducked and weaved through the alleys to try and lose the trailing monsters that slinked through the shadows behind him. This pattern carried on, though not for long, maybe about 10 to 15 minutes before the ferryman arrived at his location of choice. It was a far more run-down section of the city, a mini-slum in all honesty, yet despite its run-down appearance, it was the only place able to hold the ferryman's rowboat. Moving to said rowboat, the ferryman took one last nervous glance at his surroundings before he uncupped his hands as he set the two children down on the rowboat's edge, with Mono and Six taking the chance to back away from the ferryman, slightly obviously still on guard. Turning his gaze down to the two, the ferryman's mind raced with ideas and plans on how to get them to come along to the maw. At first he considered lying, but he quickly crushed that idea before he could begin. These two were too smart for that. Then a thought hit him, crazy and oh so risky, but potentially the only way he could safely move the two. Swallowing the lump forming in his throat, the ferryman let out a string of loosely put together words, the deep bass of his voice sounding completely out of place to the hush whisper that accompanied the sentence. Listen, you do not trust me, I can see that clearly. But I can offer you both a place less dangerous than out here. His voice was slow and deliberate, but that only seemed to fuel Mono and Six's suspicions. To the ferryman's surprise, however, Mono stepped forward, gesturing for Six to stay behind him as he moved to face the ferryman, and for the first time in 6,000 cycles the ferryman heard Mono speak. His voice was light and almost squeaky while filled with fear that Mono was clearly trying his hardest to push down. Why help us? He asked while Six tried to pull him backward away from the ferryman, but Mono stayed put, staring into his melted face. Rubbing the back of his neck, the ferryman tried to rethink his approach, Mono's straightforward question having diced his next few ideas into pieces. Okay, listen, I know of a place that can grant safety, albeit not guaranteed. Mono tilted his head curiously, the idea sounding foreign to not only him but Six, to who had now seized her attempts of pulling Mono away, now taking the time to try and paint that kind of picture in her mind. What kind of place? Mono managed to ask as he relaxed his shoulders, if only slightly, that fact that the ferryman was yet to attack them being the biggest factor to their loosened demeanors, for it was the first time in, well, forever that a monster hadn't just outright tried to either grab or kill them. The ferryman also calmed at Mono and Six softened postures, while also being more relief at Mono not just flat-out rejecting the idea of following him. Therefore he took a deep breath and began to explain. I can take you both to a place called the Maw. I will not lie to either of you, it has a great many of danger, however it has greater benefits. Mono seemed to ponder over the idea, still he seemed to have further questions. That sounds weird, was his short reply. His tone of voice sounded unsure of both the ferryman's words and of his own. That line almost made the ferryman chuckle, but he kept his voice down. Instead he looked towards Six and then to Mono as he tried to explain further. It is anything but, in fact it can be considered the most logical place you can ever find. However, there are a few other pieces I need to mention. For one, it is only found out in the sea. Second, it is a maze of pipes and passageways quite easy to get lost in if you do not know of the way. And finally, it is a place that turns you children into food. If the children had began to trust the ferryman before that said trust had just been tossed into a running blender, they backed away, postured reignited with fear and panic. The ferryman acted quick, shooting himself to a standing position as he held his hands in the air. Wait. I can sneak you both in, I have done it before to many. While his plea seemed to calm the two down slightly, it did little to regain any form of trust. The ferryman slowly lowered his arms, trying to explain again. I understand your fear, but I can assure you that I mean you no harm. I have taken other children there, I can sneak you past the main collection point. I know a few secrets. Mono was the first to step forward again, his left hand lowered to his side while his fingers curled in as if he was holding some kind of ball. The maw? We saw it on some posters. Why would we want to go there? The question made the ferryman blink before he relaxed his shoulder. Food was his simple answer, which made both Mono and Six pause in surprise and confusion. Mono tilted his head to the side along with Six, who looked to him, then back to the ferryman. There's food? Was Mono's response, which he did so as he looked back to Six, who seemed to perk up at the concept. The ferryman nodded, realizing that he could use this part to get them both to come along, as his nodding became more frantic as he tried to capitalize. That's right, it's a resort, so they keep a great deal of food on them at all times: breads, meats, vegetables, so if you learn to sneak past anything you encounter you could eat your fill. Mono and Six froze, the idea being like a sudden plot twist to a movie. After a few seconds of silence, the two seemed to huddle together, though it was only Mono doing the talking. The ferryman waited with bated breath, shoving his hands back into his pockets while his mind replayed his past words, thinking of what he could have done better. Eventually the duo did end their impromptu team huddle as Mono moved again to face the ferryman, once more his hand still keeping that same ball-holding gesture. Okay. We'll go, was all he said before he and Six slowly moved to sit in the back of the rowboat. The ferryman took a few seconds to process the simple answer, surprised on how easy the whole thing. However, it quickly turned into relief and satisfaction as he moved to take a seat in the boat's front. Thus the ferryman quickly took hold of the boat's oars, his fat fingers wrapping around the comparatively thin wood, and he slowly began to push the boat out of its dock. The ferryman carried on with little to no delay, as once he had finally angled the boat correctly, he began to paddle away, taking his time to make sure the boat never swayed to an unneeded degree as to ensure Mono and Six wouldn't panic. It took only another minute before the boat was out in open water, with the ferryman sighing in relief as it did so. He took one last glance at the previously occupied dock, where the same horde of residents could be seen staring through every available vector, their eyes cold and dead, yet the mix of disappointed and anger at being unable to catch any prey was clear. Once again the ferryman felt vile rise in his throat. It didn't take long for the three to get out into fully open water. The boat had always been of high quality, no matter its appearance. Another 20 to 30 minutes passed without a word as Mono and Six sat near the back of the boat in silence, simply staring up at the ferryman as if waiting for any kind of attack. That made the ferryman sigh, although not in annoyance but rather disappointment. I do not intend you any harm. Mono looked into the ferryman's eyes, the holes in the front of his bag showing another flicker of navy blue light as he flinched from the sudden break in silence. Six didn't flinch, however. She did seem to take in the ferryman appearance as a whole, as if she could pick him apart with a gaze, her eyes holding both suspicion and hate from the ferryman, most likely because he appeared as just another monster. Okay, Mono replied simply as he settled back into some form of confident lounging. The kind of confidence no child of nowhere should have. That confirmed it for the ferryman. Mono could use his powers, or at the very least he knew he could use them when danger arose. Another batch of silence hung in the air, with Mono and Six taking momentary glances at each other, silent messages being sent over what might as well have been telepathy. The ferryman watched the duo's mute conversion as a set of memories floated into his mind. Memories of better times. Before the ferryman could be fully locked in his reminiscing, he caught the gaze of Mono, who was staring at him with confusion and redeveloping distrust. It was then the ferryman realized he had been staring at the kid. He leaned his head back, trying to come up with something to say, something that would end whatever conflict before it could start. Then another thought hit him, or rather another memory. The ferryman took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for an answer as he turned his gaze back to Mono. Apologies, young one, but I believe it is my first time seeing someone wearing a paper bag. He lied smoothly, waiting for Mono's response. Yet no response came, at least at first. Instead, Mono felt around the edges of his bag, taking an extra second to pinch the bottom right corner where a slight tear could be seen. Six also looked to Mono, what small parts of her eyes that could be seen shone with curiosity. Most likely she had been wondering that herself, yet she had never asked. Mono did eventually look back at the ferryman, though the light in his eyes seemed distant, as if he was unsure of his own answer. It's magic, was all he said, his voice laced with a hint of static. Six blinked before turning her head towards Mono, her hood doing little to hide her confusion. The ferryman, however, smiled. A new silence passed over the three, though this one was much more comfortable as the boat's paddles gently pushed against the water, leaving a slow, steady rhythm to play in the background, almost like a lullaby. That was until the air began to thicken, a dense fog swiftly replacing the once clear skies. Mono and Six stiffened. The lack of any visibility set off all the alarms in their head. The ferryman, however, hummed in consideration, partially grateful for the wave of fog. He reached under his seat and quickly pulled out a briefcase before clicking open the latches, only somewhat opening the case just enough for the two children to slip through. Hurry! His voice was hushed and carefully, like any noise would set off an alarm. You cannot be seen even out here. Mono and Six stepped forward, finally seeing the case through the fog that was only getting thicker and thicker. The duo turned to each other before Mono slowly stepped towards the case, carefully entering before giving a thumbs up to Six, who warily followed. The ferryman placed his free hand over the case and slowly closed the lip. However, he didn't shut. He knew that could set the children off, and so he only kept it from springing open while the two children shuffled inside, staying close to the edge just in case the whole thing proved to be a trap after all. The boat began to slow his once streamlined path, turning into simple sways that somehow kept it moving forward. Then, like a jump scare in a bad horror movie, the boat hit a plate of metal. A plate of metal that was a part of one very, very big slaughterhouse. The ferryman let out a tired sigh, any form of fear never reaching even the edges of his mind. Why should he, after all? How many times had he sat next to this damn resort? How many times had he sat in this exact spot before he snuck in? However many children, how many times had her cold, dead eyes watched his every move? But thinking back to the past few thousand cycles wouldn't do anything good, and so the ferryman shook his head, seemingly to no one, yet he knew she was watching. The sign that the ferryman was now alone came when the cold chill that ran down his spine dissipated as he let out an even greater exhausted sigh. Nevertheless, he pushed down the feeling as he rested his free hand against the bottom hull of the maw, the skin on his palm and fingers shifting to something more akin to a spider in order to allow the ferryman better grip. As he kept pulling along the side of the metal plates, the ferryman glanced downward towards the slightly ajar suitcase where Mono and Six could still be felt jostling about from inside. It took another minute or so, but the ferryman did find what he was looking for, an old-looking hole towards the very bottom of the visible hull. The ferryman stared to the hole, then back to the suitcase as his mind once again took in how things were finally changing. He had honestly given up hope on seeing a day like this. He sighed again, hopefully for the final time, as he lifted the case that held the two children before gently shoving it into the vent of the maw hull, the case taking only a moment to gain speed before it slid down the pipe into the darkness below. Now alone once again, the ferryman didn't waste any time. He grabbed the boat's paddles once again and began to row with increasing vigor, his mind now left with no distractions. It was time, after all these years. Within the depths of the ocean little could be heard, as all forms of titanic and monstrous aquatic life simply floated about, letting nature run its course in something surprisingly close to normal life, until the stomping came. It shook the ocean floor, the sand getting kicked up into cloud with each step, the nearby life forms all rushing away once the sheer presence of the being was felt. It was like the end, the fear of everything just being over in the blink of an eye personified. A set of rock blocked the path for said presence. The being didn't care. With a mere tap, the boulders vanished into nothing, like an image being deleted on a computer. 1 second they were there, the next there wasn't even a speck of dust left behind. And so the being kept walking, her mind screeching with thought after thought, like a platoon of wild beasts all trying to yell over each other. Safe to say the pretender was not in the right state of mind, but could that really be blamed? After all, with living through 6,000 cycles, most anyone would go mad. But she kept walking. What little bit of her sanity left was driving her forward, a side effect being that all her thought eventually turned into the same simple phrase. He's alive! He's alive! He's alive! Her mind was the epitome of tunnel vision, so much so she paid no attention to how her body began to be covered in a green glitching energy. Then again, that was expected. It did happen every single cycle. It happened in a flash, but once the energy flickered away, the pretender appeared older, a form she was actually used to rather than the chained version that she was always stuck with at the start of each cycle. But of course she paid it no mind, rather she kept walking her path, never wavering, never even nudging in any other direction. Instead she just kept moving forward, solely locked on making it to the wasteland where she already knew they would be meeting. In the endless hall of mirrors, a titanic figure with smoke for a head was currently rushing forwards, backwards, left and right, the direction of his movement always changing every few seconds. The mirror man cursed under his breath, now deeply regretting the way he had organized this damn dimension. When he had de-iced to lock himself away to make it, so that it would be near impossible to leave that way, he never had to face what was out there, even if something tried to drag him out, but of course now that had come back to bite him. But he didn't stop. He knew it was nearly impossible to escape, but that didn't mean he wouldn't stop trying, and so he ran faster and faster, yet the endless hall of mirrors seemed to always just be one tick ahead as the mirrors began to shuffle around in every way possible, as some teleported, some broke apart internally, and some just flat out melted. The mirror man grit his non-existent teeth, hope slowly draining from his soul, until the world seemed to grind to a halt. The mirrors slowed, time itself being pulled to a near stop for everything except the mirror man himself. He paused before a smile formed at the edges of the smoke as the mirror man chuckled quietly, always one to lend a helping hand. His voice seemed to bounce around the air, as if in an echo chamber. However, he paid it no mind as he dashed forward to the now perfectly still mirrors. In a flash, the mirror man crashed against the mirror, the glass seeming to glow briefly before the mirror man was pulled inside. He landed with a thump, his gigantic form tumbling against the equally gigantic ground. He blinked, regaining his bearings, before he looked around to find himself in what looked to be just a random grass plain. The mirror man let his hands grab a few strands of grass, taking a minute to feel the wet blades in his palm, his broken mind seeming to calm if only for a moment. Safe to say it didn't last long, as the mirror bolted upright, his body regaining his usual twitch as his mind raced with ways to figure out where he was, and more importantly how to find out what direction the wasteland was in. In the wasteland, high in the sky stood, or rather floated, the north wind. The living element was still almost frozen, a complete contrast to its usual manic energy. He floated about haphazardly, his mind at a complete loss, what little amount of thoughts he had, all saying the exact same thing. This is real. This is real. The north wind did begin to move again, and when he did it came with a bang. His form loosened, his humanoid silhouette turning into something more akin to a hawk or crow as he dashed from one point to another, his form writhing with pure glee. He's back! He's back! He's back! The north wind cheered like a child getting a mountain of toys for Christmas, though to be fair, something like that completely paled in comparison to what the north wind was feeling. For a second, the north wind readied himself to zoom away to find Chime himself, for his patience was practically non-existent. However, then he stopped before he curled in on himself and began to laugh. It could feel it, the way that glitching energy seemed to bend the air around it. To the north wind it felt like a static shock, but he didn't care. Instead, what the north wind was laughing at was the way the shock seemed to send a message, though not with words but rather with intent. Stay there, we're all coming to you. It made the north wind laugh harder. The way Chime just knew that he would get lost only further cemented that he was really him. The north wind's laughter died down, his form retaking its humanoid appearance as he simply leaned back while still in the sky, as if laying down in a hammock. He couldn't believe it, yet he could accept nothing else. This was real, it was really happening, everything and everyone was coming back, at last. A plan that was 240,000 years in the making could finally be completed. A soft hum of gentle wind slowly flowed throughout the air. This quiet tune was broken, however, as every other second the sudden plop of two oar paddles could be heard pushing themselves through the surface of the ocean. Taking in a long, exhausted breath, Mush's eyes glazed over the thick marsh that filled the air around them. The change for clear ocean skies to thick swamp-like fog had been gradual, a change that had taken a full day. It was a sign that the once seemingly endless ocean would soon come to an end, replaced with actual land to traverse. It made Mush feel sick, more so than he already had before, and by anything but a smaller margin as well. While true this had been the case since Chime's return, the feeling of dread had only been piling and piling higher as he had rowed towards the wasteland. Like he was holding a bag over his shoulders, one that was constantly filling with water, one that never seemed to run out of space. It had been another 3 days since Mush and Chime had their frankly useless conversation, and since then Chime had once again settled back into silence. However, unlike before, Chime was not slumped over in a heap. Instead, he was actually sitting upright, though he was leaning forward, his veil of messy and matted hair hiding more of his features. His posture was a far cry from the usual calm and collected he normally displayed. Rather, he sat tapping his feet against the chipped bark. His arm rested on his knee while he drummed his fingers in a rhythm that broke every few seconds. Chime clicked his tongue, gently gritting his teeth to try and distract himself from the growing bundle of nerves that threatened to burst out of control. He was nervous. That much was obvious. However, unlike Mush, Chime had little experience in squashing those kind of emotions down. Therefore, in an attempt to put his mind on something else, Chime looked towards Mush, his voice low and gravely, almost to the point of a growl. "You're going to see them first." Mush's reaction was immediate. His whole body froze as his eyes widened, sweat beginning to roll down his neck. "What?" Mush yelled, dropping the oars, letting them fall back into their holsters, as he held out his hands while his fingers curled inwards from both the shock and panic. Chime nodded, the gesture accompanied by an eye roll that Mush of course could not see. "You heard me." Chime spat the tapping against his knee. A tightness pulled itself into Mush's gut as his heartbeat quickened while a lump formed in his throat. His mouth dried as he tried to plead for Chime to change his mind. "You can't," he declared. "If I do, they're gonna. Chime raised his only arm, the clock hand in each of his eyes ticking by slowly as his nerves were quickly replaced with a cold focus. "You are going." Chime's voice was final, full of authority, and to help carry the command, Chime's voice had even lost its rasp, though it was only for a moment. Mush's next argument died in his throat before he slowly slumped back, defeated. Pushing a hand through his hair, Mush took a deep breath to calm himself before he stared into the drape of hair that covered Chime's face, Mush's own expression slowly twisting into the embodiment of dread. Letting out a sharp exhale that Mush tried to keep going for as long as possible, the living flesh in human form reset his eyes on Chime, mentally preparing himself for his next question. All right, Mush's voice came out shaky and full of fear, yet he pushed it down, his constant guilt being the driving force to his pseudo-courage. He rubbed at his neck, wiping away the beads of sweat that sucked to his skin like glue. "So, what do we do then?" Chime huffed, his chest heaving as he did so, although he paid it no mind as he hummed in thought. "Simple," he stated. "You go in first, let them get some much-needed vengeance, and then I'll sneak around and heal them." Mush nodded slowly, the idea making him flinch. "Okay. But you will get there fast enough so they don't, you know." Chime smirked, a rare sight that still sent Mush reeling. However, he was still able to tell that it was in fact a confirmation. Now, with nothing left to say, Chime leaned back to his initial posture. However, a small smirk still tugged at the corner of his lips, the thought of what would soon happen to Mush filling him with a twisted kind of glee. With shaking hands, Mush tightly gripped the paddles of the boat, his whole body beginning to tremble as he carefully began to row once again. Over the past 6 days that Mush had spent taking himself and Chime to the wasteland, the living flesh in human form had stupidly thought that just maybe Chime would have healed the others before letting them go after him. It was utterly moronic in hindsight. Of course, Chime would never pass up such an opportunity, especially after all these years. Mush didn't blame him. He knew for a fact if he were in Chime's shoes he would have done the same. That did little to help calm himself though, and like a punchline to a bad joke, the thick marsh that filled the air began to thin slightly, letting both Mush and Chime spot the silhouettes of small patches of land that floated off in the distance. Mush felt his mouth go dry once more as he tried to push the still growing nerves back down. Without thinking, Mush turned to Chime, who had gone back to his skittish foot tapping while his elbow sat digging into his thigh. That made Mush blink, somehow having only just noticed the new habit even though Chime had been doing it for the past 3 days. Taking a risk, Mush decided to try and ask a question, and while his intent was to simply help his old friend, that didn't cut out the possibility of Chime taking it as some kind insult before foregoing his constant mercy. The odds made Mush shiver. Yet still, he asked, "Are you ready for this?" His tone was gentle and light, his voice in a near whisper. Chime's head tilted upwards slowly, each degree of movement making his neck crack with a constant sickening pop. A long exhale leaked from Chime's mouth, the air around the boat beginning to chill slightly. "Am I ready for this?" Mush flinched, the cold, dead tone from Chime making it clear he was in fact taking it as an insult. Mush tried to backpedal, shaking his head frantically while Chime stared him down. Wait, I mean, you look nervous." That statement, while true, felt strange on Mush's tongue, almost like eating pufferfish just without any of the danger. Chime paused, the chilling in the air vanishing as he processed Mush's apparent observation. He blinked, looking at his tapping foot before he paused again. "Huh?" Chime eventually let out a long sigh, his tone becoming more casual, although it never lost that edge of disdain. "Never felt this before. I don't like it." Mush knew that for an absolute fact. He tried to chuckle, though it came out more as a broken wheeze. the kind of sound someone having a nervous breakdown would make. Chime huffed, turning his head to the side while his voice became a small whisper. "I'll manage," was his only answer. Mush's face twisted into one of painful doubt, biting his lip though he quickly as to prevent another one of Chime's assertive reactions. Much like the rest of Mush's feelings, his doubt was mixed. On the one hand, everything that Chime was doing, the feet tapping, the slow heavy breaths, the constant shuffling, all pointed to him not being in the right headspace to move onwards. But on the other hand, Mush, for the life of him, just could not imagine Chime messing it up, or anything for that matter. Now lost in his own thoughts, Mush lost track of his surroundings, leaving him unable to brace himself as the boat suddenly banked on a small dent of mud. Mush caught himself on the boat's edges as it swayed for another second longer. Mush looking forward as Chime slowly picked himself up from his seat, taking a moment to crack his back, though he was still clearly lost in thought. Chime's gaze glossed over to grassy land just ahead on the boat before he slowly leaned down and re-equipped the cane that Mush had created, the smooth wooden surface fitting snugly in his palm. Without another word, Chime slowly hobbled his way out the boat, each step swaying his stickman-like figure. Mush followed after in more of a rush as he leapt off the boat to follow his old friend, who was moving ahead without a word. After Mush was able to catch his breath, he fell into step behind Chime, following the one-armed man as he moved further and further into the wasteland. Mush craned his neck from left to right, taking in the sight of their surroundings. Roaring winds that were tinted a dirty yellow hid the horizon from view, although that wasn't really a cause for concern, as most of the area was simply a dull grass plain with a few broken structures just barely visible off in the distance. Mush dug a finger into his ear in an attempt to rid himself of a constant ringing that bounced around his eardrum, though he had little success. It was that momentary distraction that left Mush unaware of Chime, who had suddenly changed course, turning to the right as the wind died down, revealing an old wooden barn, one that had been chopped horizontally in half. Chime stared at the destroyed barn house with a look of slow recollection, his eyebrows rising slightly as he got lost in thought so much that he completely failed to notice Mush, who was moving to stand behind him, a look of confusion on his face. With a causal turn, Chime once again ignored Mush as the one-armed man kept moving, this time towards a singular tree off in the distance, a seemingly random landmark to the unaware, but to Chime it acted like an arrow pointing them in the right direction. As the two moved onwards, Mush dived deeper and deeper into his thoughts. He was scared, there was no other way to put it. Each step felt like being struck by lightning, each breath made his throat feel as if it was being filled with cement, and each second sent him closer and closer to spiraling. Mush slammed his shaking hands into the pocket of his hoodie, while he dug his neck into the collar, trying and failing to provide himself any kind of comfort or relief. Ideas of what could happen flashed in his mind, and in all of them one thing was true: it was going to hurt. It wasn't the idea of the physical pain that made Mush want to vomit. No, he knew he could handle whatever injuries the others threw at him. No. It was the mental and emotional side that pulled at Mush's chest. The very thought of it made him feel sick. Their faces, the looks they would give him, the screams of rage and hate. Mush mentally slapped himself as a part of him tried to bring up the idea of running away. That made the pull in his chest worse as a torrent of even greater self-loathing pulsed throughout him. Chime tried to straighten himself as he hobbled forward, the cane that Mush had made clutched tightly in his bony hand. Just like before on the boat, Chime felt a chilling wave of nerves wash over him, his mind unable to figure out what to do to counteract the feeling. Much like Mush, Chime began to imagine how the upcoming event would go. However, unlike Mush, Chime couldn't help but smile at what he was envisioning. The clock hand in each of his eyes losing just a bit of their rusted ticking, turning into something smoother, something almost like before the cycle. Quickly shaking their heads, both Chime and Mush cleared their minds of most thoughts as they just kept moving forward further and further into the wasteland. Meanwhile, near the center of the entire wasteland, a certain batch of key individuals were about to gather. Dirty yellow winds swirled in a circular pattern, forming a barrier that only a select few could cross. Near the edge of the barrier stood, or rather floated, the north wind, the living form of air twitching violently as each second ticked by, its patience growing thinner and thinner with each passing moment. Inside the mind of the north wind, a chorus of voices screamed over one and another, while just one of the many sufferings that the north wind's broken mind had to endure. However, unlike any other day where the voices would scream complete gibberish, the endless sea of sounds all screeched about one thing, that being Chime, or rather what he could think of the north wind after all that he had done. He'll get it. He'll get it. He'll get it. The voices screamed all while memories of every last crime the North Winds had committed flashed through his mind. The North Wind craned its neck in random directions with enough degree of movement to break a normal person's neck instantly. The voices screeched again, trying to rationalize. He will understand. He has to. It makes perfect sense. It doesn't matter what we did since everything resets, then there's no point, so what we were just having some fun making sure to respect ourselves. Yes, yes. Exactly like he said, he will surely understand. The North Wind cackled, his voice echoing throughout the barrier. The logic was flawed, easy to pick apart, a myriad of holes appearing once anyone thought about it for more than a second, yet to the mangled mind of the North Wind it made perfect sense. Abruptly pausing his twitching, the North Wind twisted to his left as he felt a change in the barrier of wind as a figure pushed their way through. A very familiar figure. Thick fingers pushed through the wall of wind, first their dark green coloring acting as a distinct contrast to the dirty yellow that made up the air. The silhouette of the figure became more clear as they pushed further and further through the barrier before, after another few seconds, the ferryman stepped through in all his mysterious glory. Faster than the human eye could see, the North Wind raised his arm, a ball of razor-sharp air gathering around him, just waiting to be unleashed towards the ferryman, who simply stared at the North Wind with a gentle gaze. The living wind froze on the spot, the swirling vortex of roaring winds dissipating instantaneously. He lowered his arm slowly, saying nothing, not a word, yet the ferryman understood perfectly. The ferryman slowly nodded, a gesture that held more weight than any kind of words. A silence pulled itself between the two, with the ferryman slowly sighting as he reached into his coat to pull out a wooden flask. He chugged the amber liquid, shutting his eyes as he did so, simply listening to the whistling of the wind around him. Unlike the North Wind or the others, the ferryman had managed to mostly keep his sanity over the cycles, his mind being much calmer in comparison. However, while from an outside point of view that may have seemed like something to celebrate, but at times it acted more as a curse, as the ferryman was always painfully aware of both his surroundings and the consequences to his actions. He hated it, or rather he hated himself, a voice in the back of his mind always berating him for now doing better, for not doing more, for failing to stop the cycle in the first place. Chugging the last of his drink, the ferryman sighed once again, twisting the cap back onto the flask before he shoved it back into his pockets, before he let his arms fall to his side. The ferryman swayed in his spot, letting the breeze that leaked from the barrier push him in whichever direction it so desired, as he tried to clear his mind of all thoughts, because if he didn't, he was sure the anticipation would have driven him into a nervous wreck. The ferryman's attempt at calming himself was halted, however, as he felt the gaze of the North Wind bore into the back of his neck. With an exhausted turn, the ferryman returned the North Wind's stare, matching it with the rock-hard certainty that the North Wind had grown to know over the cycle. Just like before, silence was the only thing that stuck between the two as the North Wind twitched with increasing intensity, while the ferryman kept his gaze steady, filled with both exhaustion and unbridled joy for what was soon to come. Before any conversation could take place, another figure pushed itself through the barriers, the trails of smoke leaking through the wall of wind acting as the only warning before the Mirror Man stepped fully through his sudden presence, drawing the North Wind's and ferryman's attention immediately. Straightening his back, the Mirror Man tried to stand tall as he met the gaze of both the North Wind and ferryman. However, both the manic wind and the guide to nowhere could easily see through the facade. The Mirror Man held his slender hands behind his back, contrasting with the rest of his figure, which was only slightly above average weight. Despite his best efforts, the Mirror's Man body began to shake every few seconds, each shiver sending puffs of smoke into the air. It was a telltale sign of his fractured mind. The only difference between him and the North Wind was that the Mirror Man was better at hiding it. Yet his mask was cracking. The upcoming reunification brings the Mirror Man's mask from just one chip away from shattering completely. Gritting his currently non-existent teeth, the Mirror Man forced himself to move, strutting towards a more open space before he clicked his polished shoes together, standing straight and tall. The three figures stood in silence, once more the Mirror Man's sudden presence doing little to change anything. However, the Master of Illusion did received another passing glance from the ferryman, who tipped his hat towards just like the North Wind. A quick flinch was his reply as the Mirror Man turned his smoke-filled head towards nothing in particular, content to simply wait for the next few events to play out naturally. Abruptly, the North Wind jolted like he was suddenly slapped on the back. He curved round to the second-last open space within the barrier, the ferry and Mirror Man also shifting to where the North Wind was staring. A hand shot out of barrier, tiny in comparison, yet that never stopped them from swinging their arm enough force to blow a titanic hole open wide enough for both the mirror and ferryman to fit through easily. Tiny footsteps slammed against the dirt each step, digging dark green shoes into the earth, caking the footwear with mud, and a few worms, yet the wearer either didn't notice or did not care as they hunched forward. Pure white hair stuck to their face, completely soaked, just like the rest of their tiny body. However, just like their shoes, they didn't care. Instead, they huffed and panted like a rabid beast, keeping their fingers curled like the shadows themselves would soon reach out and attack. The pretender kept the same stance for a few moments, the only oversound she made being a set, unintelligent mumbles that not even she herself could decipher. She suddenly looked upwards, most likely thanks to a cough the mirror man had not so casually forced outwards. She froze on the spot like a deer in headlights, somehow having completely forgotten that the others would also be waiting for Chime. She twitched much like the north wind before she mumbled something else under his breath, her tone a mix of offense and defense. And so the four settled into a tense quiet, the only remaining sounds being the random mutters from the pretender or a sudden twitch from the north wind. The ferryman shifted slightly as the other three got lost in their mangled minds. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he wanted to do. Yet he didn't. He could only stand perfectly still as he shoved his hands back into his pockets in order to counter the chilling winds that nipped at his fingertips. His heart beat with far greater sensitivity, to the point where he could feel the individual sections of pulse as opposed to just the thing as a whole. It was driving him insane. The waiting, the silence. Yet for the life of him, he had no idea what to say, his mind going completely blank before he could start even the simplest of thoughts. He tapped his boot against the ground for a few seconds, a sign of his wavering patience. The shaking form of the mirror man stood the furthest away from everyone inside the barrier. It was a subconscious reflex, something he himself didn't even realize yet. As his mind began to wonder, he felt a familiar pang of pain shoot through his shattered psyche. Flashes of memories pulled themselves to the front of his broken mind, blowing away the smoke that clouded his thoughts. Each flash felt like a punch to the gut, each time skinning deeper and deeper into his soul. The worst part, however, most of the memories were fake. Delusions his destroyed mind had conjured to forget the pain of reality. Sharp breaths escaped from the clenched teeth of the pretender as her stance turned into something still defensive, yet now she was at least standing upright. She kept her shoulders squared and tense as her heart pounded in her ears. Her mind was mostly blank. That had been true since she had freed herself from the depths around the nest. She had been moving on pure instinct, dead set on simply reaching where she was now. But then she paused, everything finally catching up with her as she took in a few very much needed deep breaths. Suddenly she began to quiver before she devolved into a shaking mess, one that looked like someone who had been staying in pouring endless rain for hours. Her stance changed, going from an animal backed into a corner to something weaker, vulnerable. The north wind twitched for the umpteenth time while he craned his neck to glance at everyone else inside the barrier. It felt strange, to say the least, to see them all again. He couldn't remember the last time the four of them had been together in one place. Well, that was a lie. He could remember the very day when they began to break apart. The hopeless of an unwinnable war having finally broken them all. Mush stood outside the barrier of wind, watching as it surrounded the area in front of him. He swallowed another lump in his throat, his hands now shaking like a leaf. He was standing alone, Chime having left to go prepare himself while he sent Mush to get the others' attention. Once again the thought terrified him. His teeth chattered with enough force to send lines of pain into his chest, adding on to the even greater pain that pooled in his lungs. His feet felt like they were encased in concrete, causing him to freeze any time he tried to take a step forward. He did move eventually, no matter how much his remaining self-preservation's instincts said otherwise. His feet carried him forward even as he leaned back on instinct, and before he knew it, he was but inches away from the wall of wind, the dirty yellow seeming to somehow stare back at him. Mush froze for a few seconds before he raised his hand, his palm now millimeters away from the wall. He slammed his eyes shut, biting away any thoughts or images that tried to force their way to the front of his mind before he let out a defiant yell, his palm slamming against the wall with enough force to send ripples along the entire thing. The north wind twitched for the umpteenth time while he craned his neck to glance at everyone else inside the barrier. It felt strange, to say the least, to see them all again. He couldn't remember the last time the four of them had been together in one place. Well, that was a lie. He could remember the very day when they began to break apart. The hopeless of an unwinnable war having finally broken them all. Mush stood outside the barrier of wind, watching as it surrounded the area in front of him. He swallowed another lump in his throat, his hands now shaking like a leaf. He was standing alone, Chime having left to go prepare himself while he sent Mush to get the others' attention. Once again the thought terrified him. His teeth chattered with enough force to send lines of pain into his chest, adding on to the even greater pain that pooled in his lungs. His feet felt like they were encased in concrete, causing him to freeze any time he tried to take a step forward. He did move eventually, no matter how much his remaining self-preservation's instincts said otherwise. His feet carried him forward even as he leaned back on instinct, and before he knew it, he was but inches away from the wall of wind, the dirty yellow seeming to somehow stare back at him. Mush froze for a few seconds before he raised his hand, his palm now millimeters away from the wall. He slammed his eyes shut, biting away any thoughts or images that tried to force their way to the front of his mind before he let out a defiant yell, his palm slamming against the wall with enough force to send ripples along the entire thing. The barrier fizzled away instantly, though not by the force of Mush's strike, rather it was pulled to a stop. The rushing winds it was made of freezing within moments, canceling out the thing as a whole. Mush felt his entire body lock into place as he met the gaze of the others. They all stared directly at him, all having frozen completely in a mix of shock and disbelief, all of them never once making a move or saying a sound. Mush began to shake in pure terror while he oh so slowly raised his hands, trying his best to wave. However, the gesture came out rigid and rusty. H. Hey G. Guys. Within mere moments the pretender appeared in front of Mush, before her fist crashed into his face. Mush flew through the air, clutching at his face while blood gushed from his nose. His landing was anything from graceful, his whole body bouncing off a boulder that laid planted in the ground. He hobbled upwards, his body shaking from both pain and fear as he held up his hands in surrender, his voice yelling out his plea. Wait. His begging fell on deaf's ears, the pretender appearing in front of him once again with inhuman speed, her form seeming as nothing more than flickering lines of white and green. Just like before, her fist rushed towards Mush, the force of the incoming strike splitting the air around it. Her fist slammed under his chin, his jaw breaking on impact before he flew into the air, while he tried his best to ignore the pain as well as protecting himself the best he could. A shadow quickly loomed over Mush, causing him to squint, his mostly occupied mind trying to figure out the reason for the change in lighting. The reason, as it turned out, was the ferryman who had leaped into the air high above Mush, his fist clamped together like a hammer. His titanic fists collided with Mush's tiny form, the swing fueled by blind rage and hate, sending Mush soaring back towards the ground. The ground he never reached. The space directly below Mush began to glow a soft white, the light shaping itself into a simple rectangle that was about twice Mush's size. The light died out quickly, revealing itself to be a floating pane of glass, one that stayed floating in the air while Mush still flew towards it. The second Mush made contact with the pane, it glowed white once again, somehow pulling Mush inside like he was falling through water. Mush felt the direction of his fall change, turning from downwards to sideways before he crashing onto the earth, tumbling to a stop after a few moments. Mush tried to recover, coughing as he did so, his broken jaw hanging uselessly, yet he paid it no mind, even with the jolts of pain that coursed throughout it. However, as soon as Mush lifted his head upwards, his already panic-filled eyes were met by the sight of a drill, one at least 4 times his size, that was made of roaring purple and black streaks of wind, and it was streaming towards him, aiming for the center of his chest. He tried to defend himself, raising a shaking arm ready to send out a wall of flesh to block the attack. He never got the chance. Another flash of white light appeared, this one a much more angular shape, while also only being large enough to fit Mush's hand. Before Mush could react, his hand reached into the miniature portal, and while he quickly realizing his fatal error, however, it was too late as the portal closed in on itself, instantly severing Mush's hand. Rather than blood, a mass of reddish-pink, bulging flesh seeped out of the wound like rotten curdled milk. A bark of pain was all Mush was able to let out before the drill of wind slammed into his chest once again, sending Mush flying into the air, while the drill continued to rip away, digging a gaping hole into his chest, making Mush roll his eyes backwards from the overwhelming pain. The instant Mush began to decelerate, the gigantic hand of the ferryman clutched at Mush's tiny form, snatching the living flesh out of the air with full force. The ferryman stomped forward each step, breaking the ground below him as he moved in front of another rock, this one much larger and sturdier. He opened his hand, revealing that Mush had stuck to his palm like the corpse of a bug, his tiny form twitching and seething, the combined assault pushing his durability to his upper limits. The ferryman's face morphed into a rage-filled scowl before he lifted his open palm above his head. Within seconds, Mush was slammed against the boulder, the echoing crunch of his bones, snapping into pieces, acting like music to the ferryman's ears. The strike was repeated with just as much fury, if not more. Then it happened again. And again. After the fifth strike, Mush was now nothing more than a stain that smeared against the surface of the boulder, his limbs twisted and crumpled that jutted out in random directions. A barrage of huffs and pants leaked from the ferryman's melted face while he slowly raised his arms again, forming another hammer strike to send crashing towards the barely alive Mush. He never got the chance. The pretender shot towards the crumpled Mush like a bullet, once again appearing as nothing more than flickering lines of white and green. She tackled him like a wild beast, the impact having enough force to explode the boulder into minuscule pieces, while also sending Mush streaming into the air once again. However, this time the pretender was holding on with a vice grip, her teeth bared like fangs as she clutched at both of Mush's arms from the shoulders. Mush regained a sliver of consciousness just as the pretender lifted her feet, her shoes planting themselves into the wound on Mush's chest that one brought about by the drill of wind. Now standing on Mush while he flew back towards the ground, the pretender snarled again, her mind filled with nothing but hatred for the person in front of her. Her hands dug into his shoulder, breaking the skin effortlessly, the curled flesh that hid under Mush's skin trying to wriggle away in fear. Just like with the miniature portal, Mush realized what the pretender was planning that bit too late. Although he still tried to plead again, his voice come out in a garbled mess as blood pooled in his throat. "Please!" he begged, his face contorting in grief and guilt. "It's not a trick, I promise." The pretender shrieked a feral sound that burst Mush's ear drums, the blood shooting outwards as her hatred magnified tenfold. And so she pulled. Flesh and bones were ripped apart like cheap withered fabric, Mush's now severed arms being flung away without a thought, while bubbles of rotting flesh shot out from Mush's new wounds, different bundles contracting and expanding mid-air, trying desperately to return to their source. Gags of incalculable pain were all Mush was able to muster, while the pretender pushed herself off of his failing form before he crashed back into the dirt, rolling into a heap. Somehow Mush was able to look ahead of himself, his mind just barely handing on. The pretender was the first to land, the force kicking up a dust cloud its size only tempered by her own tiny form. The north wind arrived next, forming from streams of black and purple wind that gathered next to the pretender. Next was the ferryman, who crashed down from the sky with a landing that nearly matched the pretender's intensity. However, his titanic frame kept his front covered in shadows, leaving him as nothing more than a silhouette in Mush's blurry eyes. Last but not least, the mirror man appeared by exiting through another portal, this one much more akin to a random shard of glass compared to the clean, perfect rectangle he used on Mush. Mush narrowed his eyes, somehow still able to keep himself awake. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was the fact his regeneration was starting to take effect. But what he did know was that a certain one-armed figure had appeared behind the rest of his old friends. A mix between a scowl and a grin plastered on his face at the sight of Mush's current state. Somehow, someway, Mush let out a chuckle that mixed with a gurgle of blood, his eyes suddenly growing 10 times heavy as he met the gaze of Chime. Letting his head fall onto the grass, Chime coughed out another pool of blood. He sighed, saying the first thing that came to mind. Fair enough. The pretender, Northwind, ferryman, and mirror man all stepped forward, each ready to rip Mush apart. That's when the world glitched. The four attackers frozen like someone hit a simple pause button, while the ring of a distant clock bell echoed throughout the air. The space around the four began to distort, turning a bright green that glitched with constantly increasing intensity. Over the next few seconds, certain aspects of the four began to rewind. It was different for each of them. For people like the mirror and ferryman, the rewind affected certain sections of their mental state alongside their physicality, whereas for the Northwind and the pretender it went to work purely healing their broken minds. As quickly as the glitching green energy appeared, it also vanished, although with none of the subtlety. Rather, the energy compacted itself before it burst outwards in a flash of light. The mirror man groaned as he suddenly found himself in a heap upon the ground, his head spinning, as if he was just flung out of a washing machine. Without thinking, he reached up to rub at his eyes that were actually there instead of smoke. In pure shock and utter disbelief, the mirror man quickly clasped his hands over his face, and sure enough, rather than endless smoke, the mirror man could feel actual skin. Before he himself had noticed, the mirror man was mumbling out any observations he could while simultaneously taking into account his change in outfit, using that as a key piece to the sudden puzzle. Back to 6:17? But the mirror man pushed his palm against his forehead, his vision still only just unblurring. He was confused. That was the simplest way to put it, even if it oh so dramatically undersold the emotions swirling inside his mind. His coherent mind. The mirror man froze, and so too did the north wind. The ferryman and the pretender, all of them moving a slightly shaking hand towards the side of their heads, the greatest aspect finally able to be appreciated. Everything was quiet. There were no voices, no raging thoughts that thrashed around their minds. For the first time in oh so many years and cycles, their minds were at peace. They all got up slowly like a newborn fawn trying to stand for the first time. They all stood in place, still reeling from the realization that somehow, someway their minds, their sanity, had been restored. Confusion was the first thing what came over the four, their recent memories still slightly fuzzy, until a low, raspy voice sounded from behind them, carrying 240,000 years of constantly building emotion. The air turned still, the sudden silence acting as a chain that bound everyone in place, no one willing to make a move. Although that didn't last long, with the pretender breaking the deadlock by lifting her head upwards slightly, her body beginning to tremble. It didn't stop her, however, as with sheer will she broke free of the indescribable emotions that held her in place. Bit by bit her neck ticked towards the voice, her wet matted hair parting just enough to leave her eyes exposed, just enough to take in the full view. Her eyes widened in complete disbelief, her mind screeching to a halt. He was right there. He had stepped closer in the time that she and the others had taken to recenter themselves, allowing Chime to make his way to be just a few steps away from them. His only arm hung loosely at his side. His breaths were slow and barely noticeable, and most obviously of all, his legs were shaking. The two were at eye level, letting deep violet irises stare into the bright glowing green light that slipped through the cracks in Chime's drape of hair. She turned to fully face him, her movements now an eerily calm, a calm that made Chime flinch in surprise. "Chime?" she asked, voice beginning to quiver. Said boy raised his hand while he tried to wave, however, he only managed to let his wrist tremble. The pretender's face suddenly shifted, a frown pulling at her lips while her eyes squeezed shut, before warm tears started to streak down her cheeks. Chime tensed his hand, shooting it outwards even though it never reached, while he tried to soothe, to comfort, to calm, yet all that left his throat was a couple of rasps. Before he could make another attempt, the pretender shot directly at him, her speed matching the peak of her assault against mush. She slammed into his chest, the force of the impact sending shockwaves through the air behind them both. Yet somehow, someway, Chime only skidded back by a few feet as he planted his feet to help them both skid to a stop. She was crying. No, she was wailing. That Chime knew for certain as tears seeped through both his jacket and shirt. She wailed, a mess of incoherent sounds that held no structure or message. Instead, they acted as raw, unbridled emotions that flooded outwards as the stockpiled pain of 240,000 years of pain was finally being released. Chime's arm reached towards her back, his heart racing with panic. However, just as he tried to wrap his arm around her back, an arm made of black and purple wind suddenly hooked around his neck, pulling him backwards. It was the north wind, who was now jumping up and down like a child on Christmas, his hands pushing down from atop Chime's shoulder, while he screamed in pure and utter exhilaration. The living wind shouted out a barrage of glee-filled cheers, his bouncing only increasing in vigor with each passing second. "Chime! Chime! Chime!" he bellowed, continuing to pull Chime's neck back and forth like a slinky. "You're here, you're actually... ha 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 ha." The firm thud of booted footsteps made the north wind cease his shaking of Chime, the one-armed boy quickly trying to blink away his blurry vision. Chime watched as the ferryman stepped closer, although he looked far different from the Titan that was previously standing before. He was smaller for one, now matching the general size of Chime, the pretender, and the north wind. His outfit had remained the same, however his core appearance was now drastically different. Gone was the melted green-skinned face that drooped down to his waist, rather it had turned remarkably human, though he still had a few noticeable features that would turn most heads in any normal setting. He was about half a head shorter than the other three, but for what he lacked in height, he made up for in width as bulky shoulders tensed with each step he took. Pricked tufts of silver hair cascaded through the edges of his hat, reaching down just a little ways past his forehead, highlighting his eyes, which more so resembled black voids, as if his eyes were hollowed out and only the sockets remained. It was the ferryman's true form, one he had never dared to return to since the beginning of the cycle. He stepped forward again, each slight impact of his feet hitting the ground acting like shockwaves that coursed through his bones, causing his knees to involuntarily buckle. He pushed through it, curling his fingers in sheer defiance, though he was only able to take another step forward before his legs locked into place. With his left hand, the ferryman reached up to the thick woolly jumper that clung to his skin, slipping a couple of fingers inside the collar to pull it away as beads of sweat traveled downwards without restraint. He was staring at Chime's eyes, or rather he was staring at the glowing light that remained caged behind his veil of hair. Slowly the ferryman reached his free hand towards Chime, his face contorting with shock, disbelief, but above all else hope. "See, Captain?" He wheezed out his voice, still holding a firm gruffness to it, yet it was now unable to hide the unimaginable number of layers of exhaustion that hide beneath. Rather than responding with words, Chime instead sent out his only arm, grasping the ferryman's outstretched hand with strength that completely contradicted with his frail frame. The ferryman froze upon contact, his stance wavering once again, the grip feeling surreal in his hand. His mind did eventually process that the current situation was in fact real. And as soon as he did, he laughed. It was a loud and heavy sound, one that to the ferryman felt like having an ocean's worth of water lifted off his back. The last to join the reunification was the mirror man, who slowly pulled himself up from the dirt, running a hand through slick, well-combed brown hair. The twitching of his left hand brought his attention to the pair of glasses that he subconsciously held between his fingers. Without much thought, he slid the circular lenses and wooden frame up his long, angular-shaped nose, the glasses fitting perfectly, granting his vision clarity he had never thought he would see again. With twitching hands, the mirror man quickly tried to pat away any specks of dirt off his gray suit vest before he repeated the process along his black dress pants. He hooked both arms around his back, each of his hands clutching around his forearms in an attempt to calm himself as his polished shoes dug into the dirt with each step. After another few seconds, the mirror man took his place next to the ferryman before he turned his gaze towards Chime. His towering figure hung over the one-armed boy, the mirror man's face contorting much like the ferryman's. However, he leaned more into the shock and disbelief. You're alive." The mirror man's eyes widened as he spoke, each second his brain spent processing the situation, only adding to his shaking. The mirror man's shaky statement brought the final pieces to the Five's reunification. They were all overflowing with emotions that couldn't be stressed enough as the pretender continued her sobbing. The north wind kept bouncing on his feet, though he had ceased his rocking of Chime's shoulder, allowing the one-armed boy to stay upright. The ferryman kept both hands clutched around Chime palm, his laughter still booming throughout the air. To contradict the vocal expressions of the north wind, ferryman and pretender, the mirror man stood frozen, his mind still locked into place. Before either of the four could continue with their crying, cheering, or laughing, Chime suddenly tensed his hands, ripping away from the ferryman's grip to clutch at his own chest. The four went silent instantly, all pulling away while Chime curled in on himself slightly. His body trembled, his teeth pressed together, all while the other four stood completely still, unsure of what to do, as if Chime were a ticking time bomb that would go off at the slightest touch. None of the four had to make a move, however, as Chime suddenly ceased all forms of shaking, instead shifting to an eerie stillness. They flinched, each briefly reaching towards Chime, who had suddenly begun to make a near-silent sound. A chuckle. Chime reeled his head backwards, the light of his eyes shining into the sky, all while he cackled. Much like the ferryman, Chime's laugh echoed throughout the sky, yet it felt different. More triumphant. More victorious. It turned into something softer, however, as droplets of clear green glitching liquid rolled off his chin. They were his tears. That was something the other four noticed immediately, as the mirror man let out a deep sigh of relief before he dropped his head. The ferryman clutched at his chest, reflexively holding back his own bark of laughter. The north wind somehow cheered with even greater intensity, now bouncing off the balls of his feet like a jackhammer, And finally the pretender resumed her sobbing, though it was mixed in alongside her own collection of laughs. Thus the floodgates opened without restraint, the collective release of grief acting like the light at the end of the tunnel, a moment the five had been anticipating for all the years and cycles. And then there was Mush. The pain was nothing short of agonizing. Left crumbled in a heap of missing limbs and broken bones, Mush found he was only able to choke out his sobs. He wasn't upset, he wasn't even delusional enough to feel even the slightest hint of annoyance. He knew he deserved it. If anything, he was shocked that Chime had acted as quickly as he did. Abruptly Mush's wounded body began to heal itself as more curdled flesh started to ooze out of his wounds, though it was most channeled towards his now missing arms. The writhing flesh leaked outwards, its almost liquid-like form somehow bubbling as if it were molten tar. The flesh slowly reshaped itself while also changing its coloring, and after another few moments Mush had himself a new pair of arms, ones that were just as sickly pale as the rest of him. The same occurred for the rest of his wounds, Mush feeling the flesh seep throughout his insides, working to repair any amount of damage he suffered. It was anything but pleasant. It felt like his wounds were being both set on fire and dipped in acid at the same time. Mush bit his tongue, holding back the pain while he sat upright, resting a hand against his chest. After a deep breath, Mush felt the ringing in his ears subside, allowing him to listen to what was happening just a little ways in front of him. The laughing, the sobbing, the cheering. A sudden pang in his heart made Mush freeze, an almost forgotten feeling pulling itself throughout his mind. It took him a second to realize just what he was feeling. But the moment he did, his self-hatred reached new heights. It was jealousy, a simple enough feeling for Mush to identify, yet that did little to stop the rising vial that threatened to burst out from his throat. Biting his tongue, Mush began to curl his fingers in growing rage while his teeth ground together like whetstones. It wasn't the jealousy itself that made Mush feel so sick, rather it was the fact that just maybe he thought he deserved to be jealous. Even after everything he had done. Damn it, Mush spat out, his voice a whisper, however it seemed just a little too loud as the laughs of the other five died out in an instant, all of them going silent before they slowly turned to the living flesh. Chime, the pretender, the Northwind, the ferryman and the mirror man all turned towards Mush with the pace of a rusted clock. Instinctively Mush threw his arms above his head and his neck towards the ground, his body locking into place once he had done so. Mush kept his head down, unable to look any of them in the eye. Ah! Everyone but Chime whispered the chill in their voices, putting absolute zero to shame. Mush flinched, his hands now beginning to quiver. Another few seconds of silence passed before the North Wind leaned forward, wrapping an arm over Chime's shoulder, while his voice went from slow skepticism to near manic delight. Oh, the North Wind started, still lightly bouncing off the balls of his feet. Did you leave him alive so we can all kill him together? The others perked up at that, all clearly liking the idea. Mush flinched again, still half expecting Chime to go back on his promise, yet to his surprise Chime raised his hand slowly, his voice coming out in painful regret. No, he stated slowly. We need him, remember. The other four looked confused, though it was only for a moment, as soon enough certain memories replayed themselves in their minds. Chime sighed, his disappointment and reluctance evident. Still he tried to push past it, taking a step forward to regain the others' attention. That's when his knees buckled, his body lurching forward as he clutched at his chest, involuntarily letting out a hiss of pain. In a flash the four reached out, holding Chime upright while he coughed. No one dared to move, instead they all simply waited for Chime to do something, for they themselves didn't have the first clue if they should act, let alone of what to do if they did. With a long, heavy groan, Chime pulled himself back to an upright position, though he clearly strained himself as he did so. The collective sigh of relief that washed over the group acted like a calm reset button, however, it didn't completely dispel the tense atmosphere. Before anyone could comment on Chime's condition, the North Wind began to wave his arms around like a hyperactive child in an overly energetic attempt to gain the others' attention. Okay. He stammered out, his voice growing shakier as he tried to form a proper sentence. Shouldn't we deal with, in a bit? The North Wind pointed to Mush and then to Chime. I mean, you look. The rest of the message never needed to be spoken, as Chime simply nodded, a gesture that made the North Wind drop his shoulders in relief. The North Wind held out his arms, his voice turning more excited as he formed a temporary plan. Right, I have this house-based thing. The north wind rubbed the back of his neck nervously while the rest of the group gave him a set of blank stares. Chime let out a long sigh, his head tilting to the side slightly. "It's a cave filled with random junk, isn't it?" The north wind paused, before he chuckled, the sound being light and low. "Yeah," he replayed simply, his voice losing any kind of quiver. Not wanting to wait any longer, the north wind took charge, quickly bouncing away in what seemed like a random direction. Mush watched as the group began walking away, his still slightly blurry vision picking up on the small instances that hate-filled glares were sent his way. He winced both from pain and guilt as he slowly stood on wobbly knees. He wrapped an arm around his side, the pain from his regeneration still burning away. However, he tried to pay it no mind, instead using the fact he currently had no sleeves as a distraction. With only a slight amount of concentration, Mush held out both his arms, tensing them to the point they shook. More reddish-pink flesh seeped out his skin, covering his arms like papier-mâché. After a few more seconds, the flesh that coated Mush's arm performed a similar transformation, though it was of less scale. The flesh changed both its color and structure, joining itself with the torn ends of his clothing, fixing them to the point of being nearly brand new. Mush waved his arms, gently adjusting to the new feeling on his skin before he shoved his hands into the pocket of his hoodie, as he began to follow after Chime and the others, making sure to keep a good amount of distance between him and the group, though not before he picked up the cane that Chime had left behind. The small journey that the six embarked on, what for the most part rather simple and boring, the scenery of the wasteland never changing from the dirty yellow grass that covered the horizon. The group didn't really care about the view, instead each of the four diverted their full focus onto Chime. They tried to make general small talk, though the attempts withered away before they could begin. Every time one of them tried to start a sentence, they would cut themselves off, not finding the topic good enough. It never mattered, Chime would pick up on his friend's nerves as he would simply chuckle, a sound that would both re-center the four while also lightening their moods further. The north wind's apparent home was in fact just like Chime said. The front of the cave was quite unassuming, appearing as just a circular entrance that reached further and further into what looked to be endless darkness. Sliding on his feet, the north wind led Chime and the other inside, while Mush once again waiting a few extra seconds before moving in himself. Somehow the cave would twist and turn, the only reason for the group's ability to traverse the darkness being the north wind, who would point out when and where to turn, acting as a much-needed guide. Eventually the pitch-black dark would be consumed by orange flickering light. The source of the illumination would quickly be revealed as rows of flames that all hung from the roof of the cave, all suspended on metal trays that hung from ropes, the flames being constantly surrounded by swirling vortexes of wind that kept the fires alive. The north wind slid of his feet like an professional ice skater, spinning quickly to face the rest of the group. "Tada!" he cheered, trying his best to show off his so-called home. His home, however, was just like Chime had predicted. It was a bunch junk. A myriad of Titanic-sized item-formed piles that overflowed in random direction, creating a sort of maze that was only traversable due to the ground's tiny size. The group gave the north wind a blank stare, their lips pressed into thin lines which made the living wind shrink back, rubbing his neck nervously while he craned his neck away. Chime tried to step forward, yet he stumbled once again. The support from the others vanished with his sudden movement. Hands made of wind wrapped around Chime's wrist, their owner immediately trying to prevent another moment of panic. He pulled Chime along into the maze, rapidly firing off what were meant to be words but instead came out as incoherent dribble. The mirror man, the ferryman, and the pretender blinked, all momentarily stunned. The reactions of the three varied as the ferryman hurried after Chime and the north wind, all while he mumbled something under his breath. The mirror man was about to follow before he held himself back, an idea suddenly crossing his mind, one he found too perfect to pass up on. Taking a quick glance at the surrounding junk, the mirror man was lucky enough to find exactly what he was looking for. Crossing her arms, the pretender found herself momentarily distracted as the mirror man rushed over to a pane of glass that rested against a broken table leg. She raised her eyebrows once the mirror man had slipped through the reflective surface, the murky flash of white light acting as a sign that the mirror man was going someplace far, at least for the time being. For a second she debated whether or not she should call him back or go after the other three. But then a third option showed itself. The smell of rotten flesh filled the air as Mush finally arrived at the main section of the cave. He held his head down, one hand in his pocket while the other loosely clutched at the cane he had made for Chime. He slipped to a path that diverted off to the left, clearly trying to avoid the others for as long as possible. Clenching her fist to the point her knuckles turned white, the pretender openly let a sneer stretch across her lips. Her blood boiled, the reminder that Mush was still alive, acting like a flaming knife wound to the gut. Chime's words were the only thing holding her back for going completely ballistic on the living flesh. However, that didn't mean she could air out her feelings in another way. With that, the pretender slowly turned before she began to stalk after Mush, her steps near silent like a predator hunting its prey. As the north wind pulled Chime into a more open area, the one-armed boy had to press his hand against his forehead to try and stop his head from spinning. The living wind didn't seem to notice. Instead, he seemed slightly panicked as he dashed from one pile to another, clearly trying to find something. Before Chime could regain his friend's attention, the north wind suddenly clapped his hands together before he held out both his arms to the side, sweeping them to the left as if he was clearing a table of its contents. An enormous gust of wind crashed against a small pile of junk, the mix of broken wooden planks and other random objects, flying over to another larger pile that acted almost like a wall. Once the dust had settled, the reason for the north wind's sudden clearance had been revealed. A simple blue leather couch sat almost like a throne, its old weathered seams looking as if they would break apart at any moment. The best part, however, was that the chair was actually the right size, not overly gigantic unlike nearly everything else. Chime gave a passing glance to the north wind, who was fidgeting nervously, swaying back and forth on the balls of his feet. Sending the living wind a small smile, Chime carefully hobbled towards the chair, letting himself sink into the old leather. That made the north wind calm down, if only slightly. However, he still seemed slightly panicked as he began to search the contents of the nearby piles. Okay. He muttered to himself, taking another glance at Chime. Do you need anything else? Food, water, life support? Before Chime could calm him down, the north wind took off into deeper sections of the cave, his form losing the humanoid shape, instead going back to its simplest state of actual wind. A sigh leaked from Chime's mouth, although a soft smile crossed his lips at his friend's attempt of care. He leaned back, trying to get comfortable, but his attempt was interrupted by a small flash of white light that was caught by the corner of his eye. An earthy smell slipped through Chime's nose as the mirror man appeared around the corner, a mug in one hand and a teacup in the other. He gave Chime an unsure look, the state of his friend still completely surreal to him. Still, he put his plan into action, slowly handing Chime the mug while he himself gently cupped his own drink with both hands. Chime took it without a word, staring into the amber liquid with a gentle gaze. The sight of the tea brought back certain memories, ones that made Chime smile once again, a sight that the mirror man took as the sign to start drinking. In perfect sync, they both slowly gulped down the drink, the almost sickly sweet flavor warming their throats just enough to not be painful. Letting out a long breath through his nose, Chime looked up at the mirror man, who still looked unsure, his expression riddled with anxiety. Another smile pulled at Chime's lips, although this one was wider yet also gentler, almost like a wave that perfectly smoothed out the sand on the shore. Thanks, Otto. Otto smiled for the first time in oh so many years, his free hand subconsciously combing through his hair. Thanks, was all Otto managed to say before he went back to fidgeting, glancing around at the random piles that made up the walls. Coming up with a quick solution to his friend's nerves, Chime nodded to the direction that the north wind had flown away to. If you don't mind, could you go find North? He's grabbing stuff we don't need. Otto blinked before he nodded, returning back to the pane of broken glass, stepping into it without preamble. Now alone once again, Chime settled his gaze back onto the mug of tea in his hand. Then he clenched his teeth together, biting down the pain that bubbled in his chest as the liquid entered his stomach. The sound of hurried footsteps made Chime force himself to appear calm, which he was able to do just in time for the ferryman to appear out of the maze of junk, his sliver hair briefly falling to his eyes as he looked mostly annoyed. His gaze calmed once he noticed Chime the ferryman brushing away the tufts of hair that covered his hollowed eyes before he walked over to the one-armed boy leaning against a wooden plank that rested beside the leather chair. Much like the mirror man, a silence passed over the two as the ferryman kept his hands in his pockets while he dropped his head down to the floor. Chime didn't press for his friend to say anything, rather he simply waited for the ferryman to take the first step. The ferryman let out a shaking breath, a giveaway that he was ready to speak. He swallowed, a lump forming in his throat as his voice came out barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. The ferryman gripped the fabric of his pockets, his voice shaking with a mix of self-hatred and overwhelming relief. However, he never had a chance to continue as Chime set down his mug before he placed his hand on the ferryman's shoulder. "Don't," Chime said, his voice stern. Turning his eyes, the ferryman stared at Chime, briefly stunned. "You have nothing to apologize for," Chime stated, the glow of his eyes brightening slightly. The ferryman tried to argue, but Chime cut him off. "I know what you've been doing. You spent this whole time trying to help, trying to be a shield. Why should you be sorry for that?" The ferryman froze, his mind grinding to a halt. Few seconds later, and his mind seemed to somewhat process the idea as his shoulders loosened before he let out a shaking breath, his body quivering as he did so. Yet the guilt in his face remained. Chime tightened his grip in response as he tried to smile, although the light in his eyes dimmed. "It's okay. Let's focus on the now. Okay?" The ferryman slowly nodded, thankful for the change in topic. Chime nodded as well before a thought crossed his mind. Slowly he turned to where the ferryman had came from, tilting his head slightly in thought. "Where's... Oh." Chime trailed off, slowly releasing what the last member of their group was probably doing. Slipping past bits of jutted junk, Mush moved further and further into a more closed-off section of the cave where the light had begun to reach the limits of its range. He was trying to hide from the others that could be seen by anyone, and safe to say he was utterly desperate to achieve it. He threw the cane to the side, the fancy wooden stick bounced around the uneven floor randomly. He hunched over briefly, holding himself against a plank of wood for support. He felt sick, as if the acid in his stomach was melting through insides without any resistance. A couple of grunts was all he managed to use as a sign of discomfort as he tried to push the growing vial back down his throat. Then the footsteps came from behind him. It was small clacks, each sounding a few seconds apart. Mush froze, his body locking into place like a deer in headlights, his feeling of sick exploding to new heights. His worst fears were coming to life, something so much worse than simple being attacked like before. With enough terror to fill a natural disaster scenario, Mush slowly and painfully turned his head to the source of the noise. The pretender creeped into his view, her form hunched forward slightly like a beast ready to maul at a helpless rabbit. Mush flinched from the sight, squeezing his eyes shut on pure reflex. The pretender let out a long breath, her fingers gripped a nearby bit of wood with enough force to break it apart like cheap, brittle crackers. However, she didn't speak. Instead, she just stared at the living flesh, her blood boiling with each passing second, yet she never made a move. But to Mush that was worse. At least when she had tried to kill him, the pain took most of his mind's focus, but with what she was doing now he had no such luxury. And so he waited, bracing himself for whatever the pretender had to say. "You made Chime kill him." Mush wasn't ready for that. The statement acted like a stake through the heart as Mush instantly crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath as if he had been shot. He felt as if his throat was closed up, his hands and knees scarping against the jagged stone floor. Gauging out clumps of flesh, Mush turned towards the pretender, staring into her cold, dead eyes with panic, and shook. "You know?" He coughed, trying a failing to push himself upright. The pretender kept her gaze locked towards Mush's downright pathetic state, a sneer once again crossing her lips. "We all know. You really think we wouldn't notice something like that?" The question was rhetorical. Mush knew that for a fact, but it did little to downsize the pain twisting in his heart. "Look," he tried to plea. "I'm sore dash." He was cut off by the pretender, who slammed her palm against a random bar of metal, the gigantic alloy instantly vanishing into nothing upon contact. "Don't," she said, holding out a hand that shook with nearly uncontrollable hate. "Don't you dare." She paused, taking in a painful long breath through her nose as she tried with all her might to not just crush the living flesh like a juicy grape. As the pretender glances back down to Mush, she found her next words failed to leave her throat. She had absolutely no clue on what to say, and now that she really thought about it, she didn't really have a plan when she started to follow him. Part of her, the emotional side of her, once again wanted to rip Mush to shreds. Yet she held herself back, Chime's statement replaying itself in her mind. She knew she knew that if she stared, she wouldn't stop. That didn't mean she had to like it through. However, she did understand its importance, no matter how much it made her grind her teeth together. And so she just stood there, periodically curling in her fingers while her emotions clashed together. Mush watched the pretender like a deer in headlights, his absolute fear and worry locking in place as he waited for her next move. It wasn't the pretender that made the next move, however, as the thud of booted footsteps slowly made their way towards to the two. The pretender turned just in time to see the ferryman appear from around another corner, one hand shoved in his pocket while the other was used to point towards the way he came from. "Come on, the others are waiting," he stated simple before he began to make his way back without another word. Mush slowly pushed himself to his feet using the random pieces of junk to support his shaking legs. He froze for the final time as the pretender sent him one last hate-filled glare. Mush felt his stomach burn again, though he tried his best to ignore it. He slouched forward, trying to appear as small as possible before he slowly followed the pretender who was following after the ferryman. The three twisted through the small gaps in between the piles of junk, each completely lost in thought. For the ferryman, what was to come, or rather what would now come thanks to Chime's return. For the pretender, she focused on the now and how everything had been happening so fast it felt as if had been thrown through a vortex. And finally for Mush, he focused on the past and on everything he had done wrong. So much wrong. Back in the central area of the cave, Chime slowly drummed his fingers along the arm rest of the chair, waiting for the other three to arrive. Up directly above Chime sat the North Wind, who was settled on top of a junk pile, swinging his legs back and forth as if staying still would cause him to disintegrate. To Chime's left stood Otto, who was still slowly sipping away at his somehow still warm tea, a look of apprehension plastered across his face. He fiddled with the cuffs of his white shirt, the fabric looking to trap heat around Otto's wrists, making the man sweat slightly. Soon enough the other arrived, with the ferryman moved to stand at Chime's right, the guide to nowhere, crossing his hands over his chest as he lowered his head slightly. The pretender moved next, stepped towards a sheet of metal that leaned against a somewhat large pile of rocks. Last and definitely least, Mush slumped his way in, trying to remain as unnoticeable as possible. It didn't work. The others saw him immediately, all of them gaining their own expressions of disgust and rage. Towards the space furthest away from everyone, silently sitting in the cold hard stone floor. With that, the six apexes of nowhere sat in silence, the only sound being the gentle rushing of the wind. No one said anything, or rather no one had the bravery needed to say something, as everyone, even Chime, found any sort of idea sliced apart by their own minds before anything could form. Then came a cough, a sound so weak and pathetic it could only belong to one person. Mush leaned forward, his eyes remaining downcast as the others all slowly craned their gazes toward him. He felt as his throat was closing once more, yet he pushed it down, trying with all his might to ask something that had been on this mind since he and Chime had left the Pale City. "So?" He stared, however, he immediately winced away when the others growled in, annoying at him doing, well, anything. Yet his kept going, pushing through his own fears to try and make any form of progress. What's the actual plan? Despite the others' unbridled hatred of Mush, they found themselves considering his words as they glanced to Chime, who seemed slightly taken aback. Chime blinked for a few seconds before he shrugged. "I don't know." Stunned silence. That was the only way to describe the reaction of the others. The North Wind abruptly stopped swaying. Otto set down his tea. The ferryman glanced at Chime with a blank stare. The pretender tilted her head in confusion, and Mush stayed frozen like a statue, like a record that was suddenly took off the player. Chime felt the gazes and immediately rubbed at the back of his neck, giving off a weak chuckle. "Right, my bad," he said, weakening, trying to turn away in slight embarrassment. "I, didn't think about planning ahead." His voice trailed off, growing distance. "I just wanted to get back." The shaky statement changed the others' reactions. Within seconds, all of them understand the unspoken meaning. The first four sighed, giving Chime a somber smile, before they tried to change the subject. However, they all struggled to find something else to talk about. Their attempts were cut off, however, as Chime cleared his throat while he leaned forward, his tone turning more serious. "The end goal is still the same." The other listened in without a word, all gaining expressions of weariness and concern, certain memories trickling back into their minds. With a sigh, Chime steeled himself as he began to lay out details that the others had wanted to know since the cycle's beginning. "When I was gone," Chime tugged at his collar, pressing his teeth together as he tried to force the words out. "I was fighting it." Everyone besides Mush snapped their heads towards Chime, all with looks of either shock or horror. Chime held up his hand, silencing the others before they could launch a barrage of questions. I know. Gently he sighed, leaning back into the leather chair while he looked off into the distance, lost in thought. Long story short, at the start I managed to hit the things. I guess. His lips pressed into a thin line, trying to put together something that could both explain what was needed while also keeping it short. Okay, here's what's important, he stated, deciding to skip most of the details. That thing has my arm, he said, pointed towards the said missing arm. The others nodded along without a sound, letting Chime explain further. He leaned forward again, each second adding to his nerves. I can kill it, he said with certainty, the kind the others all knew and loved. But I need my arm back. Turns out with it missing, I can't do everything. That made the others pause. It was the first time they had heard something so weak from Chime. It clearly affected Chime too, as the one-armed boy frowned in a swirl of emotions too dense to explain. The sudden voice of the north wind cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife through butter as he tried to get what he thought was the most important part of the current topic. All right. How would you do that? Chime glanced up at North once again, trying to put together a proper explanation. I need something to push me through. An extra charge. Chime looked away, his tone making it clear he wasn't satisfied by the idea, or at the very least his explanation of the idea. Also looking away in thought, the others began to silently brainstorm, setting another tense atmosphere throughout the air. It was the ferryman who broke the silence as he slowly turned to Chime, his tone unsure and careful. What if we got your weaver? Everyone paused, at first blinking in confusion before the memories came flooding back. Slowly Chime turned his gaze towards the ferryman, the light of his eyes brightened as a smile was pulled across his lips. That could work? With that, Chime held out his hand for a fist bump, his smile being felt through the air. Thanks, Joseph. Joseph gave a grateful smile, tapping his larger fist against Chime's frail fingers. Much to everyone's surprise, Chime pushed himself up off the chair, his energy now seeming just a little bit higher. He swayed on his, managing to keep his balance thanks to Joseph, who clasped a hand on the one-armed boy's shoulder. Giving the guide to nowhere a small nod, Chime stepped forward, his movements still sluggish and painful, yet they were now edged with something akin to excitement. The idea of finally making any kind of progressing filling Chime with an almost childlike glee. With that, Chime moved to head back towards the path that the north wind had taken him down, clearly intending to leave the cave as a whole. He gave a quick nod towards the maze, signaling the others to follow him. They did so, although with mixed reactions. The north wind floated down with a cheer, slipping next to Chime before wrapped an arm over the one-armed boy's neck, barraging him with questions, all of which was directed towards any potential stories Chime could tell. Otto moved next, though he did so with a sigh, muttering about how grouping up at the cave had been mostly pointless. Yet he didn't care, as he found that Chime's enthusiasm was like a weight was being lifted off his shoulders. It was exactly like he remembered. Watching the three making their way back through the maze of the cave, the pretender let a small sigh leak from her mouth. The excitement that filled the others was lacking when it came to motivating her to move forward. She stayed leaning against the wall, rolling her tumps around each other. She couldn't begin to describe what she was feeling. Mush watched as the pretender shook her head to dispel whatever she was thinking about before he pushed herself off the wall to follow the other three. He was about to follow suit, trying to once again keep as low a profile as possible. Yet that plan was ripped to pieces once heavy footsteps set themselves next to Mush. It was the ferryman whose bulky figure had stepped next to Mush without a word. Shrinking away with a wince, Mush tried to pull into himself further, even though he was already resembling a snail that had hidden away in its shell. Yet as Mush prepared himself for another emotional thrashing like the pretenders, the ferryman simply stood in place, starting at Mush with his hollowed-out eyes. The ensuing silence made Mush feel as if he was being crushed by an industrial press, each passing moment adding to the weight that pushed down on him from the inside and out. But the ferryman never moved in gaze, staying locked onto the now quivering Mush. His hatred could be felt through the air just like the others. But it was different. Instead of a raging fire or freezing cold ice, being near the ferryman felt like being pulled underwater each second, making Mush believe that his lungs were being filled with some sappy viscous liquid. The ferryman did speak eventually, his voice low and eerily even. You? He cut himself off, finding that wherever he was about to just wasn't good enough. Mush nodded nonetheless, picking up on the unspoken message instantly. "Yeah," was his shaky reply, still finding himself unable to look towards the ferryman. Another suffocating silence passed over the two as Mush tried to muster up the strength to move onwards. It didn't work. The sudden sound of the ferryman shoving his hands into his coat's pockets made Mush flinch. However, before he could look up, the ferryman had already walked away, trying to catch up with him and the other. Mush slowly followed after. In the fields of the grassy wasteland, Chime stood in between the North Wind and Otto, who were both flinging question after question towards him, although their tones did vary. The North Wind was like a hyperactive child, constantly sliding his feet across the ground while he excitedly asked Chime about moments from his 240,000-year-long battle. So if the blood stuff's like acid, how come you still have you feet? Chime sighed, though it lacked any form of annoyance as he rolled his neck. Just pushed it away. The North Wind understood straight away, and while he found the answer a little boring, he did understand the needs for Chime to be efficient. Otto was the next to speak, his tone more subdued as he tried to change the subject. "So, where are we going now?" Chime hummed before he glanced up at Otto. "Well, we gotta get moving somehow." Before Otto can ask for a further explanation, Chime rolled his neck to the side, glancing to the ferryman who was now catching up. "Hey Joseph, you made sure to dock your boat, right?" "I," was Joseph's simple answer as he fell into step beside the pretender, who was still lost in thought. Chime nodded in approval, upping his pace slightly while the others moved to catch up. And so their walk across the wasteland continued for the next few hours as the old friends used that time to chip away at time they had spent separated, though each of them knew it was only the tip of iceberg, for better or for worse. The group eventually reached their desired destination, which sat resting against a small bed of land much like the boat Chime and Mush had used. This one, however, belonged to the ferryman, which was easily deduced thanks to its sheer size. Separating from Chime, the North Wind floated up to the side of the enormous boat, balancing along the edge with instinctual ease. Chime hobbled over to the boat with the assistance of Otto, who had slung an arm over his shoulder, almost treating him as if he was bleeding out. Whatever Chime was thinking about was something he kept to himself as he was pulled to the same edge of the boat that the North Wind stood upon. Chime shook away his partly put-together thoughts as the North Wind made a slight spinning gesture with his wrist. A funnel of wind formed underneath the one-armed boy, spinning around in a cyclone before it began to lift him upwards, almost like being pulled up while resting in a hammock. Taking a second to balance himself, Chime was set down on the same edge of the boat before the one-armed boy slowly slid down to its center, pulling himself onto one of the seats nearest the back. Keeping his gaze on Chime, the North Wind repeated his gesture, pulling Otto in nearly the exact same way, although Otto did take a second to dust off his vest once he settled on the wooden boat. Suddenly a shadow loomed over the three, causing them to turn slightly, though not in fear or panic, as they knew fine well what it was. The sudden was Joseph, who had turned back into his ferryman form, his melted face hiding any emotions as he stood to the side of his boat waiting for the remaining two to get on. Leaping into the air without another thought, the pretender landed in the boat with a thud, shaking the wooden ship slightly before she settled on the same seat as Chime, although she sat a little ways away, still lost in her own thoughts. Last and definitely least, Mush moved to the back of the boat, a tendril of flesh already pouring out his hand. It slivered up the wooden shine as if it were tar hooking over the edge before it pulled Mush up and onto the boat. Mush pulled the flesh back, regaining his hand. Once he did so, however, his focus stayed elsewhere as he tried to figure out a way to stay away from the others while still staying on the boat. At first he considered hanging off the edge, but he quickly decided against it, eventually deciding to just slump down at a corner of the boat, hoping that he could be left alone. To Mush's surprise, his wish seemed to be granted as the ferryman rested his hand against the boat's edge before he gently pushed it towards the water. The boat slipped into the gentle waves, with the ferryman carefully stepping onto the boat as if did so. Slowly he sat at the front, his back turned to the others while he wrapped his fingers around the paddles. He pushed the oars into the water, pulling the boat across the waves with mindless ease. He wasn't really paying attention to his movement, his muscle memory was doing the work for him. Instead, he had diverted his attention to listen to the world around him. Or rather, the people now sitting in his boat. Chime hadn't moved from where he had first sat down. He still stayed next to the North Wind, who had returned to constantly barraging Chime with questions that somehow sounded excited. Standing in front of Chime was Otto, who had his arms held behind his back while his face was turned into a confused and nervous expression. Chime glanced at the taller man, tilting his head to the left. What wrong? His voice was still dry and coarse, yet it held a softness that lessened Otto's worry, if only slightly. Taking a deep breath through his nose, Otto made the eye currently acted as Chime's eyes. Where are we going now? Otto asked while his lips pressed into a thin line, as he already had an idea on Chime's answer. Said boy paused, before he chuckled, nervously shrinking away slowly. Ah, right, Otto sighed, his suspicions confirmed. The north wind paused his questioning, tilting his head to an almost comical degree. Where we going? Can't you just bring it to us like normal? Chime and Otto glanced at each other before Chime gestured to his missing arm. That made the north wind pause again, his voice turning slightly shaky. Oh right, sorry, was all the north wind managed to say before Chime sighed, while he leaned forward, resting his chin on his palm. The sudden reminder of Chime's new limits made the three cut back on whatever they were about to say. A low hum flowed through the air, pulling Chime's, Otto's, and the north wind's attention to its source. The ferryman's deep voice echoed throughout the air, his hum turning into something almost like a growl, though it lacked any form of animosity. Rather, it was simply one of his many habits one used to show when he was getting ready to speak his mind. Would tracking it work? He mumbled, turning his head towards Chime, who began to drum his fingers against his knee. Eventually Chime nodded, running the idea through his mind. Yeah, that could work. Now, with at least some form of a solution, Chime's mood lightened instantly. However, Otto found the answer less than satisfactory as he raised an eyebrow towards the ferryman. And how, pray tell, do we track it? Not missing a beat, the ferryman let out another grunt. The steam stack, he answered simply. That made the others pause, even getting Mush to look up with a stare that at first was one of confusion before it turned into one of realization. The statement made the others perk up, old memories being recalled to the surface. That place is still around? Otto asked, a hint of disbelief evident in his tone. The ferryman nodded, turning back to the ocean that was now fully in view. Aye, he answered, simply beginning to row with increased intensity. With the short and simple answer, the others found themselves satisfied as Chime smiled softly, happy at it having a more tangible goal. The north wind bounced in his seat, excitedly reminiscing on Founder's times he had almost forgotten. Otto immediately went to work planning out the best possible path. The pretender took in the information subconsciously, while Mush simply nodded, willing to just go with whatever the others were planning. Chime turned to both the north wind and Otto, ready to discuss the new development. But a near-silent voice cut him off. Chime, the voice called, calm and steady. The other turned to the voice, seeing the pretender, who was sitting at the edge of the boat, watching the ocean's waves with a distant gaze. Said boy tilted his head, although he was able to pick up the underlying message as he slowly stood to see what she wanted. Otto and the north wind were ready to follow, however a sharp glare from the pretender froze them in place like statues. They knew that glare, they knew what it meant, and safe to say they were not willing to argue. With that, the north wind and Otto swiveled on the spot before they scooted over to the opposite side of the boat, giving the pretender the space she desired. Chime stepped next to the pretender, waiting for her to elaborate on her call. Instead, she slid along the seat, giving just enough space for Chime to slot himself between her and the boat's edge. He did so without a second, though however her continued silence did seem to put him on edge. As Chime sat down, the pretender shifting her gaze, moving to stare down at the floor of the boat, all while Chime waited patiently for her to say, well, anything. Yet she said nothing. That made Chime begin to sweat, his mind hurriedly trying to figure out what was causing her silence. At first he suspected that it had something to do with how he hadn't had a full one-on-one conversation with her. But he knew that wasn't it. And so he turned to her, still trying to decipher the cause for her silence. Then she met his gaze with her own. Perfect, still purple eyes met the glowing green that hid behind Chime's curtain of hair. She sighed. She knew what he had been doing. Unlike the others, she could pick apart the trick. The light of his eyes. The light he had been using to redirect their attention, to keep it away from what he didn't want them to see. Chime felt the gently weight of her gaze, feeling like a pressure that pushed down on him from all sides. He chuckled nervously, trying to breaking the ice. Her eyes remained locked towards his while his hands reached down as he clamped around his wrist. She pulled his hand upwards, effortlessly holding it between the both of them. Then Chime froze. Her eyes moved from the light of his eye before it settled on his hand, her focusing honing in instantly. Although it wasn't on how bony the hand was, nor was it on how it was shaking slightly. No, her focus was on the scars. The sight was enough to make most people vomit. layers upon layers of scar tissue piled on top of one another, each layer made up of a different type of injury. From slashes, burns, punctures, tears, bite marks, and even some infections all covered every pore of his visible skin. Simply put, if someone weren't to believe that Chime had been fighting for 240,000 years, the scars would be all the proof they needed. Chime froze once the pretender's gaze settled on his hand, any form on nerves subsiding into brief shock before it settled into an uncomfortable unease. He tried to pull away, but her grip remained firm, and so Chime turned his head away, instead his voice turning to a near whisper. "It's not like I'm gonna break apart." He tried to continue, but the pretender cut him off, holding out his hand so it would fill his peripheral vision. "Are you sure?" she questioned, tone turning more stern while she leaned in closer. Chime flinched away, his hand tightening into a fist. However, it soon relaxed, though not by Chime's own accord. The pretender sighed, glancing away from Chime's eyes and instead going back to his hand. "What did that thing do to you?" It wasn't a question, it was more like a statement, one that made Chime scoff, though it wasn't directed at the pretender. "Should have seen what I did to it." There was venom in Chime's tone, venom that, to the pretender, sounded completely alien. Chime sighed, slumping down slightly to rest his head on the side of the boat, which gave the pretender the perfect chance to spot more scared skin. It could be seen alongside of his neck, the only part that remained visible thanks to Chime's current position. It acted as confirmation that Chime's injuries extended past his head, which only made the pretender want to press the subject further. But she didn't, as the moment she tried to, she felt as if her throat had sealed shut. Yet she refused to simply let the conversation die out, even if it painful. She knew certain things need to be brought up, no matter how much neither of them wanted to. Thus she steeled her resolve, clearing her throat before she brought up another topic of near equal importance. "What do we do about them?" Chime perked up, lifting his head off the edge of the boat in order to glance at the pretender in the light of his eyes, refocusing within seconds. He nodded towards the ferryman, his voice trying to a near whisper. "Took them to the maw," he answered simply, still keeping his voice to a whisper. She blinked, taking a second to process the statement before slowly her mind deduced the reason. So she nodded slowly, at first still imagining the concept. "Okay. But..." She paused, choosing her next words carefully for both Chime's sake and her own. "Don't you want to see them, to see him?" The singular mention of a certain bag-headed boy made Chime push himself off the boat's edge, now sitting upright while his hand drummed nervously against his knee. "I don't know if I can handle it." The pretender glanced at Chime, ready to retort, but he cut her off, his voice somehow getting lower. "You think you could?" That made he freeze. She couldn't. Not a chance. Not after everything. And so she pulled away, settling in a posture near identical to Chime, the only difference being that her hands were clasped together. A silence held itself over the two, both Chime and the pretender remaining silent, each unable to speak due to a mix of nerves and other melding emotions. It was Chime who spoke next, understanding the need for the current talk while also trying to keep the subject matter as light as possible. "So, other than that, Despite his best efforts, Chime was unable to keep the talk going. However, he didn't have to. The pretender rested a hand of Chime's shoulder, her grip somehow firm yet gentle. "Just talk to us. Okay?" Chime paused, turning slightly to meet her gaze before he nodded, rolling his neck to try and lessen his nerves. "Yeah, okay." Now sitting in a far more comfortable atmosphere, the two found themselves engaging in simple small that, while holding no real importance, acted as a metaphorical breath of fresh air, something they both desperately needed. Over on the other side of the boat, Otto and the North stood watching now fully revealed ocean that stretched beyond the horizon. Otto stood tall, holding his arms behind his back, while the north wind sat along the edge, kicking his feet at without a care in the world. Letting out a sigh, Otto pushed his glasses back up his face, rubbing at his nose while he did so. The north wind picked up on the hidden reasons for Otto's exhausting choosing to huff in slight annoyance. "Dude, you worry too much," he huffed again, leaning back to looking into the late evening sky. Otto glanced towards the north wind, only sighing deeper at the carefree attitude he almost never dropped. "You really don't have any more questions?" Despite the skepticism in Otto's tone, he knew fine well that the north wind truly didn't care, or rather he was to truly to feel worried. The north wind scoffed, rolled his head with sarcastic flair. "Oh, come on, we'll be fine." Otto remained silent, although only briefly, as he let his gaze fully settle on the north wind, his tone turning more serious while he also got quieter. "That thing hurt him. The north wind froze in place, the surrounding air touring eerily still. Slowly the north wind twisted towards Otto, and despite the lack of any facial features, the almost dangerous expression was easy to see. "You heard him. He will kill it." Otto listened to the north wind's jarring deadpan tone, however he never wavered. North. For what the statement lacked in length, it made up for in underlying depth. Turning back to stare at the ocean, the north wind huffed, relaxing his posture. I know, just we're all here, we're all back. Don't ruin that." Even though the last section was structured as a demand, it sounded more as a plea, one that spoken softly and without much of the north wind's usual energy. "Don't be so dour," the gruff voice of the ferryman whispered. Otto and the north wind perked up at the sound, turning to see the ferryman, who was keeping his eyes ahead at the ever-expansive sea. "We'll just take this one day at a time," Otto sighed at the ferryman's blunt logic, though he found the simplified viewpoint oddly comforting. As it turns out, the north wind was just as appreciative, if not more, as he began to regain his child-like excited, while he lightly jabbed an elbow into Otto's side. "Exactly so, just lighten up, dude. It's better than before." Letting out another sigh, the ferryman began to paddle with slightly more intensity. "Agreed. But enough on that. Can't stay out here forever." With that, they returned to what they were doing before settling into a cozy calm. Thus hours passed as Chime and the Pretender tried to chip away on the time they had spent apart. Otto and the north wind continued to discuss various random topics. The ferryman kept rowing the boat with a single-minded determination, and finally Mush spent his time trying to sink back in corner as much as possible. By the time they had began to approach their destination, it was the dead of night, the stars lighting up the sky like a child's nightlight. To contradict the natural beauty of the night sky, a sight of opposite grace could be seen off in the distance. Thanks to darkness of the night, it was almost impossible to make out what exactly came up out of the water, unless whoever already knew what it was. Leaking out from a man-made section of carved-out ocean was an endless stream of wispy steam floating out in a semicircle. However, there was more to the strange sight, as right next to the steam pitch-black smoke always floated out, filling the over half of the titanic circle. Simply put, it was a vast circle made from steam on one side and smoke on the other, with a line to split them down the middle. Eventually the boat drifted next to the steam side of the circle, resting nearest its peak, causing the groups to divert their attention towards the wall of steam. Placing the oars back into their holsters, the ferryman slowly stood up his titanic frame, making the boat rock slightly as he did so. Slowly he turned, facing the wall of steam, without much of a reaction, as he instead held his arm out to the side. Within seconds his arm had shifted, going from a short yet bulky limb to a long thin chain with a hook attached to the end. He dropped his newly morphed limb into the pitch-black waters, letting it sink deeper and deeper to what seemed like impossible lengths. After what seemed like hours, but what was in truth only a minute, the ferryman's shifted limb gently tapped against what he was looking for. Moving the chain around for only a second, the ferryman felt as the hook latched around a handle fitting perfectly around his hook hand. Wrapping his free arm around the chain, the ferryman took a long, deep breath before he pulled. His shoulders tensed, the boat beginning to sway left and right as he tried to keep his balance, yet, even with his visible struggle, the others never showed any signs of nerves or weariness. Instead, they watched with relaxed postures, all showing a casual trust that demonstrated unmatched confidence. Sure enough, after a few more seconds, the handle was pulled out of its place, which was when the mechanical magic began to whirl. Within seconds, the surrounding water began to boil, bubbles popping along the surface. Next came the hissing, a high-pitched sound that leaked from around the boat. Finally, a visible change made its appearance alongside the noise, coming in the form of 4 copper walls that reached out from the water surrounding the boat with a rusty screech. The walls rose around the group, locking into place once they were just above the height of the boat. Another hiss sounded from below the water as a thick copper floor slid out from one of the walls, settling just underneath the boat, pushing it upwards slightly. Yet another screech came as a sign for more mechanical movement, this time acting as part of the same floor, pulling back into the walls. However, once it did, it revealed how the first section of the floor was riddled with holes, almost like a cheese grater. Once the bottom section of floor clicked, slunk back into place, the water that was held within the walls began to drain to a ludicrous degree, like shattering the bottom of a glass. Slowly the floor began to roll down the walls, taking the boat along with it into constantly growing darkness. As the boat was carried further and further down, the 6 found themselves lost in their own thoughts. The ferryman tried to mentally prepare himself for whatever they could face, Otto tried to plan out the best possible route. The north wind reminisced on before the cycle, particular the fun they had. Mush remained indifferent as he tried to keep himself as calm as possible. The pretender rolled her eyes at her own memories, and finally Chime was trying to recall everything he could about the place they would soon truly enter. After a few minutes of sinking deeper and deeper, another mechanical creak sounded from the front. The next sudden change came in the form of light which leaked out from a wall that was beginning to rise upwards like a gate to a castle. The wall rose higher and higher, letting more light burst towards the group, forcing them to cover their eyes with a hiss of annoyance. Eventually their vision adjusted, allowing the group to see what was beyond the walls. A city. A mechanical city, to be more precise. Copper pipes lined the tightly packed buildings, while steam filled the air, warping it with sheer heat. Each section of infrastructure wrapped around each other, every last inch of space being taken up with something like a building or a walkway. Stepping out onto one of the walkways, the group took a moment to reacquaint themselves with the steampunk-style city. Chime stepped in between the bars of the railing, trying to look through the fog like steam. The north wind kept a carefree posture as he slid his feet across iron floor, spinning around slowly to take in the sights. Otto remained focused on forming a plan, trying to map out the walkways the best he could. Mush stayed indifferent, although he gave the area a small glance, whipping beads of sweat that were already beginning to form. The pretender continued to be stoic, crossing her arms while she waiting for the others to move. Shifting once again, the ferryman returned back to his true form as he pulled away tufts of silver hair that had somehow already stuck to his face. He stepped next to Chime, also trying to look past the steam, though with noticeably less focus. Instead, he glanced at Chime, his expression making it clear he wanted to say something, but he found the words too difficult to say. Chime picked up on his friend's hesitance, immediately giving him a small nod that told him it was okay to say whatever he was thinking. Taking in a deep breath, Joseph spoke his mind. "Feels like old times." Chime paused, slightly shocked at the statement, before he chuckled, a raspy sound that lifted Joseph's dour mood. The slight upbeat to the atmosphere was cut off, however, as Chime leaned back against the railing, his own posture making it clearly he had something to say himself. Joseph raised an eyebrow, more curious rather than concerned. "What is it?" he asked, watching for any ticks Chime could give off. Nothing. It's kinda greedy." Joseph raised an eyebrow, settling into a more casual stance. "Can't be that bad," he stated, simply waiting for Chime to continue. Letting out a small huff, Chime caved, holding out his hand. "Can I have my hat back?" That made Joseph blink in confusion, before he scratched at his head. His fingers pushed into the fabric of the fedora, which reminded him of who the hat truly belonged to. With an almost frantic panic, Joseph clutched at the fabric, shoving it into Chime's hand with blinding speed. Right? Sorry," Chime chuckled, giving Joseph a small nod before he placed the hat on his veil of hair. The hat didn't fit it, more so just sat on Chime's hair. But still it felt right. The others noticed Chime's addition to his attire, stepping over to him and Joseph. With that, the group carried on into an adventure just like the old days. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, a much more dramatic scene was unfolding. Being carried down by a lift similar to the one used by the ferryman was a boat. However, there was some key differences. The sheer scale was the most prevalent, for while the ferryman entrance was made from with the dimensions of his boat in mind, this elevator was enormous in comparison. The same could be said for the boat, a massive ferry, one that wasn't in the best condition. In truth, the thing looked like it had been through a battlefield, with most of its upper hull missing, while fire damage stretched across everything else. The ship leaned against one of the elevator's walls, keeping it upright as it lowered further and further down. Unlike with the ferryman and the others, however, one of the wall did in fact not immediately open up to grant passage. Instead, the ship's inhabitants were met with the sight of a hulking electric field on that acted like a door. Standing in front of the field were 2 guards, each of average height yet incredibly chubby. It wasn't their build or uniform that would bring them attention. No. The source of their regard would come from the crude bits of metal that jutted out of their skin. Consisting of mostly copper wires of pipes, the metal instruments were kept poorly hidden under the guard's skin, steam leaking out from their pores every few seconds. Watching in shock and confusion as the main door to the ferry was kicked off, the guard braced themselves as a small metal bridge shot out, landing on the elevator floor, before a horde of fat and plump residents charged towards them. The horde pulled back once they reached the guard, who flinched back as the mass of other residents began to howl, a mix of incoherent shouts and yells that fought for any kind of presence. The guards tried to regain control, trying to yell over the horde, but the task proved impossible, until one of the horde made a fatal mistake. Reaching out a bloated hand, one of horde tried to wrap its sausage fingers around the guard's shoulder, attempting to push past. That proved to be the last mistake it ever made. With lightning speed, the guard reached down to its belt, pulling off a copper baton that cracked with electricity. It raised the weapon above its head. The normal resident have only enough time to widen its eyes before the guard swung. Flesh and bone caved under the force, the bloated resident falling to the floor with a thump, the back of his head looking more akin to clay than skin. The sudden spout of violence made the rest of the horde freeze like deers in headlights, while the guards used to the chance to take back control. Both guard held their weapon, barking at the board to step back. The walking sacks of meat complied, shuffling back without a word. Humming in approval, the guard began to drawl out in more nonsensical dribble, the language only being able to be understood by the horde. With that, the selected members of the horde began to explain what exactly had happened to them and the ship they arrived on. But on the said ship, sometime else was developing. Near silent taps echoed across the floorboards as two figures tried to get a view of the current scene. They watched with, before curiosity and concern, waiting for what the monsters would do. When they saw no changes, they decided to keep moving, making their way to the S side of the boat, the one that rested against the metal wall. Slowly they climbed, boosting each other up, before they eventually managed to reach the ship's edge, granting them a better view. They remained unnoticed, mostly thanks to one factor: their size, or better yet, their lack of size. They were no ordinary figures. No, for standing on the edge of the ferry was a certain bag-headed boy and a girl in a bright yellow raincoat.